Hello and welcome to 4 hours of React and Redux tutorials and instruction. This video is made up of 7 tutorials for learning Redux with React that build upon each other much like the chapters of a book. Before beginning, I recommend that you already know the basics of React. This video is for Redux beginners, but not absolute beginners in React. Throughout the lessons in this video, I will mention links being available in the description below. I've compiled all of these links into one GitHub resource that you will find in the description. Hi, I'm Dave Gray, and I'm the creator of these Redux with React tutorials. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel for more tutorials like this one. You can also follow me on Twitter, and if you're feeling generous, you can even buy me a cup of coffee. Let's get started learning Redux with Chapter 1. Overall, Redux is a global state manager that allows you to manage your app state in a single place, which can be very useful. The creators of Redux now recommend implementing Redux through the use of Redux Toolkit. Redux Toolkit addresses several common complaints about Redux, including complex store configuration, too many added packages, and too much code to implement overall. Long story short, Redux Toolkit is an easier modern way to implement the power of Redux as a global state manager. Today we're going to create a simple example project to learn how to set up Redux Toolkit and get some initial exposure to how it all works. So you can see here in Visual Studio Code I have a basic project set up with very few dependencies, so I've removed the things already that we will not be using. I used Create React App, of course, to create the project. And then in the index.js, I've removed some of the boilerplate code that we don't usually use, the same with the app.js. And in the index.css, I've put in some of my own CSS, but of course you could get this from the source code in the description, or you could just create your own. What we're going to focus on today, though, is the logic of Redux Toolkit. So back at the package.json, I'm going to open up a terminal window, and we're going to go ahead and install Redux Toolkit. Okay, we're going to use npm install, and then we'll put the @ symbol and redux.js/toolkit, and then put react-redux and press enter. And this will install, and as soon as it completes, we'll be up and running. And it's already ready to go. Okay, I'm going to close out of the terminal window, and in the source folder, or the source directory of our file tree, let's create another directory and name this app in all lowercase. Now inside the app directory, we're going to create a store, and we'll just name it store.js. Okay, Redux Store and Redux are kind of used interchangeably. Both stand for a container for JavaScript apps, and it stores the whole state of the app in an immutable object tree. And really the intended pattern for Redux is just to have a single store for your application. Multiple stores are possible, but that is not what is recommended by the creators of Redux. To start our store, we're going to import, and then we want to import configure store from redux.js/toolkit. And after we have that, let's go ahead and just say export const, set the store equal to that configure store. And now inside the configure store, we have an object, and it holds a reducer. And now this reducer is going to be empty for now, but we're going to come back and put in reducers that we create. So we'll just save this file. After creating our store, we need to go back to the index.js and import that. So let's import, and now we'll have store, and let's go ahead and say that is from our ./app and then /store. And besides that import, we also need to import a provider, which will provide this global state to our app. So that comes from React-Redux. And now that we have the provider, if you're familiar with the context API and the use context hook, this looks very familiar because we're just going to wrap the app in the provider. And now we say store equal to store. So we're passing that in. And then we're going to have a closing tag for the provider, of course, and that needs to come after our app. So we're wrapping the app with the provider, and now our store, our global state, will be available to the app. With that complete, we need to create a features directory inside of our source directory. So I'll click for a new directory, and now I want to type features And now inside of this directory, we're going to create another directory for our counter because we're creating a counter example today. So that is one of the features. And now this counter will have a slice. And the name slice comes from splitting up Redux state objects into multiple slices of state. So a slice is really a collection of reducer logic and actions for a single feature in the app. For example, a blog might have a slice for posts and another slice for comments. You would handle the logic of each differently, so they each get their own slice. So now for the counter, we're going to create a slice. So we're in the counter folder, and I'll create a new file here, and I'll name this counter slice with camel case, so a capital S, .js. We'll start the counter slice with an import, and here we need to import create slice, and it comes from Redux.js Toolkit. And now we're going to create an initial state. So that's exactly what we'll name this const. And here we'll set this equal to count, and we'll just start it with a value of 0. Now after that, we need to go ahead and start to create our counter slice. So I'll just type export const, and now counter slice. We'll set this equal to our create slice that we've imported, and now an object inside of it. It starts with a name. So let's just name this counter. After that, the second argument that will be passed in, or the parameter as we define this, is the initial state. And then after that, we have reducers. And now this is where we would name all of our different actions. This starts to look similar to the use reducer hook that is built in to React already. So if you're familiar with that, that will help. But we're going to create a couple of actions for our counter. One is increment, and now we'll have an anonymous function here that receives the state. And inside this, we'll take the state.count that we defined above in our initial state, and we'll just add 1 to the total. And now I'm going to highlight this, press Shift Alt and the down arrow to copy it down. But remember, we need a comma because this is an object. So we have our increment, and now let's change this increment to decrement, which means we need to change the plus symbol to a minus. And so this subtracts 1 from the total too. So we've created 2 actions inside of our reducer. Now we need to export both our actions and our reducer. So here I'll say export const, and we'll destructure those actions. So we have increment and decrement, and then those are destructured from our counter slice dot actions. And it looks like I need to press Alt-Z to wrap the code. And I'm going to scroll this up so you can see it a little better as well. Actually, I could just press Control-B right now and you can see it all in one line. That hides the file tree. Okay, and at the bottom we need to say export default, and here we'll take our counter slice again that we've created, and this is the full reducer that we export here. So let's save. Now both of these must be exported. If we want to use these actions, we need to export them, and we can see they're available from the counterslice.actions. We also need to export the full reducer because the store will need that. Okay, let's show the file tree again, and now let's go back to the store because we need to import our reducer. So at the top, we'll say import, and this will be counter reducer, and that will be from, now we'll have 2 dots, features, and then counter, and finally counter slice. And I'll press Alt-Z to wrap this code so we can see it all at once. Now that we have the counter reducer, we need to put it here in the reducer object where we save some space for it. So we'll say counter and then counter reducer and save. Now we could easily have other slices that we're importing as well to the same store. So we need to remember that, and you might want to save a comma after each one. And it doesn't hurt to have the comma even if you only have one in here. Now that we've added the counter reducer to the store, it is available to the entire app through the provider that we put here in the index.js, and you can see the provider provides the store. So with that available, let's now create our counter component inside of the counter directory, and we will have that logic available to us. So let's go ahead and create counter with a capital C.js. Now I have React ES7 snippets installed, so I can type RAFCE and press enter, and I get a functional expression component created quickly. So if you don't have that, you might want to look into that extension or just type out this basic stuff right here for our functional component. Now at the top of the file, I want to import, and I'm going to import a couple of hooks from Redux. One is called use selector, and the other one is use dispatch. And now that I have those imported, let's go ahead and import our actions that we created. So we have an increment and a decrement that we both created inside of that reducer, the counter slice, actually the counter reducer that's in the counter slice. So this will come from the counter slice, which we're already in the folder where it is, so it's easy to navigate to. With the imports complete, let's go ahead and add our state to the component. So here we'll have our count, and we'll set that equal to use selector. Now inside the selector, we'll reference the state. Now I'll have an arrow, and I'll say state.counter.count. Once again, I can see I'm exceeding the width, so I'm going to press Control B to hide that file tree for now, so we'll just stay in the component and you can see all of the code. Okay, after count is defined, I also want to define the dispatch, and now with the dispatch we'll just set that equal to use dispatch. We're now ready to add some JSX to the code here, so I'm going to eliminate this div that we have, and inside the JSX I'm going to create a section element, and then inside of the section element a paragraph, and the paragraph is just going to display our count state. And after the paragraph, I'm going to add a div, and inside the div, I'm going to have a button, and this button is just going to have a plus symbol, and then I could copy that down and then create one with a minus symbol. Now both of these need an on click as well, so we'll set the on click equal to, now we'll have an anonymous function, and inside the anonymous function we can call the dispatch, and inside the dispatch we can pass any of those actions we created. So here we'll have the increment, and now we call that inside the dispatch as well. And actually I'll copy this down once again. I should have waited to copy down before. Get rid of that extra button, and now we'll just change this to our decrement, and we'll change that plus symbol to a minus, and that's our basic JSX here for the counter. Now we need to go back to the file tree and to our app.js, and we'll import the counter at the top. So we'll say import counter, and that's not what I wanted. I just needed to import the counter component. So import counter from, and here it will be from features, and then counter, and finally there's our counter file. Okay, inside the JSX we'll just put in the counter component and save. Now we're ready to open up a terminal window with control and backtick, type npm start, and we'll see what happens with our app. I'm going to drag over the Visual Studio Code window so we can see both actually. Here we go. So we've got the code on the left and the app on the right. Hide the file tree so we see more of the code. Okay, plus, that's working just fine. Decrement here, so increment, decrement, everything's good with the basic app function here. And of course, this is a very simple example, so it just shows you kind of how Redux Toolkit is set up and the structure overall for an application. Let's go ahead and add a couple of more actions so you can experiment a little bit with the pattern and see how more actions would be added. I'm going to drag the code back over to full screen, and now that we have that, I'll close the terminal. To add the new actions, we need to go to our counter slice file, and we'll just add more actions right here in this reducers object. So the first one I want to add is a reset, which is simply going to reset everything for us. So we'll have our state, and we'll set this to an anonymous function, and here the state.count will just be set to 0, so it resets the value for us. Now the next one I want to add will be just a little more complex, but not too bad. We'll call this increment by amount. Now it's going to receive not only the state, but an action. And now inside, we'll go ahead and say state.count, and this is going to be actually plus equal, And now we'll set the action.payload. Once again, this kind of goes back to referencing the useReducer hook because it also has payloads. So here, this will be an amount that we pass in, and it will be in the payload of this function. Now, after we add new actions, we have to remember to go ahead and export those as well. So here we'll export reset along with it, and then increment by amount and save. Now we've already exported our reducer to the store, so we don't need to do that again. We've just added these new actions. So let's just go back to the component and we can put these actions to work for us. So we have increment and decrement, and I'm going to put these on separate lines now. So increment, decrement, and after that we're going to have reset, and after that we'll have increment. If I could spell increment, there we go, increment by amount. And then we'll put that on another line and save that much to get the formatting. So now we have our actions imported, and I'm going to need to do one other import here, and this will be import use state. And there it is from React, because we're going to use that for the amount that we choose to increment by. So now, besides these hooks that we have here, let's go ahead and set up our state for that increment amount. And let's just call it that, increment amount, and set increment amount. Now I'll set that equal to use state, and we'll just start out with a value of 0. I'm going to define one more variable here, and it's just because we're going to use a text input, so we need to verify that we get a number value. So we'll say increment amount, which is the state, and if it is not a number, we're checking it right there, we'll just use the short circuit to set it equal to 0, so we don't get a not a number value returned, and this will ensure we have a number either added, or it will at least be 0 if a number is not in the input. And now a quick function definition, and I'll call this reset all, because I would not only want to reset the state, I want to reset our use state value of the increment amount as well. So we'll say set increment amount, and we'll set that to 0, and then we'll also use our dispatch that will set our global state using the reset action, and that will be set back to 0 as well with that action that we defined. Now let's put these to work inside the JSX. So inside of this section that we've already created, let's go ahead and add an input element. And besides the input, it says type text. I guess that would be okay. Let's put this on another line and tab in. There we go. So besides the text attribute, let's go ahead and add a value attribute to make this a controlled input, and it will have the increment amount that we defined in use state. And then it's going to have an on change, and we set that equal to an anonymous function that gets the event, and then inside of this we'll say set increment amount, and we pass in the e.target.value. So just a traditional controlled input for us. After the input, I'm going to scroll up for some more room. I want to add another div, and then inside the div I'm going to have two buttons again. So I'll have a button, and let's say on this button add amount, and let's go ahead and add the on click here for the button as well. So on click equals an anonymous function, and our pattern before stays the same. So then we call dispatch, and now we'll say increment by amount, which is a little bit longer name for our action, but that's what it is. And then we'll just pass in that add value variable that I defined above. I'm going to press Alt-Z to wrap the code so you can see it all. So we defined add value to make sure that it was a number, so it's either 0 or the number that is input, and that was defined above. But here we're calling our action with dispatch once again. Now I'm going to copy this down, and the on click here for the second button will be much simpler. We'll just pass in the reset all function that we defined above, and here instead of add amount we'll just put reset, just one T, and save. Okay, I'm going to drag Visual Studio Code over to the left, and we can see our component. It now has the new input and the new buttons as well. So any amount that we add here, say 10, and we click add amount, our state is going up by tens, and if we reset, yes, it sets both to 0. See if we can put in a negative number, -2, and we add, yep, that works too. So anything we put in here, and of course an ABC shouldn't work, it should identify, so yeah, it's just 0 there, so that doesn't change anything. So if we go by 2s, we can go back up. All good. So our app is working, and overall this shows you how to implement a simple state and some basic actions and get the whole Redux toolkit structure up and running. To better understand Redux app structure and data flow, today we'll be building a simple React bulletin board app and manage the global state with Redux Toolkit. In Visual Studio Code, you can see I've got a project already open and I've already installed Redux Toolkit. And essentially you could get this starter code, you could download it from the source code link in the description for the resources, or you could just delete the counter feature from the first tutorial in this series if you've completed that, and you'll have this beginner code. So we've already got Redux Toolkit installed, and you can see React here in the dependencies. After that, if we go to the index, you'll see we've already imported the store and the provider. We're providing the store to the app, and of course the store is created, and we don't have a reducer in here right now because I've removed that counter feature that we had in the first tutorial of this series. So this is basically where you want to start anytime you would use Redux Toolkit with an app, as far as creating a store, importing that store and the provider, and then providing the store for the global state to the app. So we've got that completed already. I've got some CSS that you can get from the resources as well if you download the code, or you could just supply your own. And then in the app, we have just a basic function component here that is empty. I've switched the div you typically get to a main element, and that's about it. So let's get started. Our first step today will be to add a new feature in our features directory. And if you don't have a features directory, go ahead and create one now inside of the source directory. So here we're going to add a posts feature. So we'll add a posts directory. And then inside the posts directory, let's create a posts slice. And slice is where we divide up our state. So this will have everything to do with the posts we create. And we want to start with import create slice, and that should come from Redux Toolkit. And there it is. Now I'm going to just paste in some code, and we can see what we would have in this slice. So we start with an initial state, and I have just hard coded in a couple of posts. I'm going to press Control B to hide the file tree right now so you can see all of that. And so we just have 2 posts with ID, title, and content. And this is an array with 2 objects, really. And then we've got our post slice that we create, and it accepts a name. So we name that post. Then we pass in the initial state that I've just hard-coded above. And then we have reducers, which I haven't supplied any of those yet. And then we export the post slice reducer. Okay, I'll save this file. We'll show the file tree again because anytime we create a reducer like this, we need to add it to the store. So let's go back to the store.js now, and here we need to import the reducer. So we're going to import posts reducer, and this will come from, and then we go up a folder, and then we go into the features folder, and then we go into the post folder, and finally we find our post slice right there. Okay, after we've imported that, we need to put it in the reducer as well. So here we'll say posts, and then we pass in the posts reducer. And we could put a comma now, or we could do it later when we add another reducer. Right now, we'll just leave it like this and save. Now back in our posts feature, we need to go ahead and create a post list component. So let's call this posts list.js. And we'll start this out by importing the use selector. So we'll say import use selector, and that comes from React Redux. After that, we can create a functional component, and I'll type RAFCE because I have ES7 snippets installed. Press tab, and I have a functional component already created for me. So that helps out quite a bit, but I'm going to change what's inside of it. So I'll just select this return, and I'm going to paste in the rest of the code, and we'll quickly review. So now we're using the selector that we imported, and you can see we've got the state, and we're just getting all the posts that are in our state. After that, we're defining rendered posts. So we're mapping over the posts, and we're creating an article for each post, essentially creating a post here for each one that's contained in posts. We pull in the ID, the title, and the content. Notice we're using substring, so we're just getting the first 100 characters there for that to preview essentially the post if it was a long post. And then we're using the rendered post in the JSX. So we've kind of pulled that logic up here instead of putting it in the JSX, and it makes that JSX very clean. And then of course we're exporting the post list here at the bottom, and we save the file. Now before we move on and use this component, we need to talk about this use selector, because right now it receives the state and then we get state.post. But what if the structure of our state changed? Right now this component needs to know something about the state. It needs to know we go state.post. It could be state.post something else in the future. We don't know. So it would be better if we create a selector in the slice and then export it. And that way, if the shape of the state ever changed, we wouldn't have to go through and change each component. We could just change it once in the slice. So let's do that. We'll go back to the slice, and here just above the export default, we'll go ahead and say export const, and then let's call this select all posts. And we'll set this equal to an anonymous function that receives the state and essentially does what we did have in the component. So here's our state post. So this selects all the posts, but we're exporting this now. So let's save this, and then we can import it into our post list. So here we will say import select all posts, and that comes from our post slice. And then we can just use it right here instead of what we did have in the use selector. So we'll say select all posts, and this will work in the same way, but now if the shape of the state ever changes, essentially, we'll just need to change it in the slice and not in every component. Now let's go to our app.js and import the post list component. So we'll say import posts list, and there I see it in the list below, and that comes from our features, posts, and then the post list component. And now we can use it inside the main element here in the JSX. So here's our post list, and save. And now let's go ahead and open a terminal window with control backtick and type npm start to just see our progress so far. And I'm going to pull Visual Studio Code over here to the left side of the screen, and we should see our React app start up over here in a new tab on the right side of the screen. And there we are. So we've got posts, and we've got our two posts. It says Learning Redux Toolkit, and the body says I've heard good things. Then we've got slices, and yes, the more I say slices, the more I want pizza. So that is what we had in our state. If we pull this back over and we look at this, I'll close the terminal here. But let's go back to the post slice, and here is our state. I'll hide the file tree so we can see it all, and there were our two posts. So yes, they appeared as we expected. Now we want to be able to add new posts with a form, but before we do that, we really need to create a reducer function that will handle the data we submit. So we're going to create a post added function that goes here inside of the reducers in the slice. I'm going to paste this in, and we'll take a look at it. So we've got post added, and it receives the state and an action. And then we get the payload, which would be the form data that we send, or we actually dispatch when we dispatch our post added. So we dispatch the action, and then it of course has the payload that is the form data. And then notice we're pushing this to state. Now we'll talk about this state.push in just a second, because if you are familiar enough with React, you know we don't usually mutate state, and that's what .push would do to an array. So we'll talk about that in just a second. But right now, after we add post added, we also need to export that. So just under our selector, let's say export const, and then we'll have post added, and then that's going to equal posts slice, if we can type that right, slice dot actions, and we save. So when we write this post added function, then create slice automatically generates an action creator function with the same name. Now when we export our actions, we're actually exporting this action creator function that is automatically created. So that's why you don't see post slice dot actions above. It's just automatically created. So I know that could look a little confusing at first, but that is how that works. Now let's talk about the state.push. And I'm I'm used to writing state like I would spread in the state and then have the action payload as a new item instead of state.push. But React Toolkit uses Immer.js under the hood, and that allows you to write your JavaScript like this, where you would normally be mutating the state, but it is not mutating the state. Immer.js creates new state underneath. Now, realize this only works inside of the create slice. Anywhere else in your application, you still need to use the proper way of not mutating the state that you've probably learned as you learned React, if not before. However, inside of the create slice, you can use state.push, and you can directly set the state in other ways as well, and Immer.js will handle that. So it makes it easier to handle inside of here. And if you're curious, I'm going to provide a link below in the description to the page for Immer.js. Now that we have our reducer function to handle the form data and we've exported an action creator, let's go back to our file tree, and we need to create a new component, and that would be the form component. So let's call this add post form.js. Now at the top, I'm going to import use state, and there I see it in the list. After we've done that, I'm going to use RAFCE once again and press tab, and now we've got the outline of our add post form component. And then once again inside, I'm just going to select what we have here and paste the basic form component, and we can go over it. It looks like, is there an error somewhere? Possibly. I'll find that as we go. Worth a short discussion here. We've got use state. So just because we're using Redux doesn't mean we won't use state in some components, because this is a temporary state. It's just a controlled form input for title and content. And so we don't really need to send those to the global state. They're just for this component. So we only want to send things to the global state that other components would possibly use throughout the application. And eventually we could expand this application where other components would be using what we're sending to the global state, although this is a simple example. Nevertheless, title and content are just going to be using state here because it's only for this component. Now, as we scroll down, we can see we've got an on title changed and an on content changed, and they're just using the set title and set content and getting the event target value. And that's a typical controlled form. So that's essentially what we have here in our form. And let's see if we can find where that error is. It looks like we're missing a parentheses down here. Yep. And now if we save, there's no more error, and we're exporting here at the bottom. So again, a basic form. You can download the source code or create it on your own, but you've got a form, label, input, controlled value, and of course the on change event for each one of these. We have not added the save logic yet, so we don't currently have an on click in the button to save the post, but that's coming right up. Let's go ahead and add the logic that we'll need to save any new post. So at the top, once again, we need to import, and this will be use dispatch. There I see it in our list, and that comes from React Redux. And now we also want to import a nano ID. There it is, and that comes from Redux.js Toolkit. Nano ID will help us generate a random ID, so you don't need to import something else like a package like UUID or something like that. Redux.js Toolkit already has nano ID. Okay, one more import. Let's go ahead and import post added from our post slice. And now we can use that inside of the add post form. Okay, let's scroll just a little bit, and underneath our on content changed, we're going to add an on save post clicked. And I'll go ahead and copy and paste this in, and we will break it down. Let me save just so it formats better. Okay, our on save post clicked function, and this is what we will trigger with the button in our form to save. We're checking to see if we have title and if we have content value. Then we're going to dispatch our post added action, and then that will get the ID that we create with the nano ID that we imported above from Redux Toolkit, and it will also pass the title and the content. Notice these are in an object, and then we're just setting the local state for the title and the content back to empty. And that should pretty much be it. So now all we need to do is go to our button and add the on click here at the bottom. So besides the type form, which we could put on a separate line, And we'll break that down to a separate line as well and come over. Let's put our on click right here. So we have on click. We'll set this equal to on save post click and save. Okay, I'll drag Visual Studio Code back over to the left and we can look at this. What we haven't done yet, I guess, is provide the form to the app.js. So once again, I'll drag this back real quick. We've exported the form, so now let's go ahead and import it to the app.js. And so that will be here, and we'll say import, and this would be the add post form. There we go, and not an image abbreviation, but there it is from our features post add post form. And then once we have that, we just need to add it to the JSX. So let's add it above the post list. So we'll say add post form, close it out there and save. Now let's go back and see if it's showing up and if we can add something. And it looks like I missed importing the dispatch into the form. So once again, I'm dragging back. I'm going to go to the form, look at the top here. I've got use dispatch, but we didn't set the dispatch once we got down into the form. And of course, we need to do that as well. So we've got dispatch right here. Let's just set it right here at the top. We'll say const dispatch. If I could spell dispatch, there we go. Set it equal to use dispatch. And there we should be good to go now. So let's go back. This time we're ready to go. So we can add a new post. And here I'm just going to say, hey there, test 1, 2, enter. And we've got our new post at the bottom of our post list right now. So the two existing ones we had, and then our new post is down here. So everything's working as expected so far. So right now the form is working, but it could be better. And let's talk about that. That's because right now it needs to know the details about the state once again in order to send it properly. It has to send a properly formatted object. And it would be better if we could abstract some of that. We don't want to duplicate this type of logic in every component that posts to our global state. So instead, we can handle this back in the slice with a prepare callback. And a prepare callback can generate unique IDs, format the data, return the object with the payload, and that's basically kind of what we're doing here. So this will really simplify our component and it will handle everything once again back in the slice. So let's go to the slice. So our first step here will be to add a colon after post added and start another curly bracket there. And so of course we'll have another curly bracket underneath as well. And we could save that much to get the proper formatting, I think. Well, maybe not. What am I missing? So we'll fix this in just a second, I guess. We need to put reducer right here, and then we have a state action. Of course, we've got our colon, curly bracket, reducer, state action. We've still got the state.push with the action.payload there. Oh, and then we need a comma afterwards. So let's go ahead and do that, and then tab this in. And then as we tab over, our post added looks better already. And now let's put our prepare callback in here right after the reducer. So it's still under post added. And now you can see we have prepare here. And here we're passing in the title and the content that we would get from the component. And then it returns the action payload as it needs to be formatted. So we have a return here, and then we have our payload. And this is where we define the ID with nano ID. So we're going to need to import that here in our slice. Title and content. And it looks like underneath here, maybe we need one more curly bracket, yep, to stop that error. But that, of course, provides a reducer and a prepare callback for our post added reducer function. So let's save this now, and then we'll go back to the top and import that nano ID before we forget. There we go. And now we've got both of those imported as well. And now let's go back to the add post form where we can simplify what we're doing right here. So instead of everything we were passing to the post added before, we'll just say title and content. And the rest will really be handled inside of our prepare callback function. And the benefit here is that our component, once again, doesn't even have to know the structure of the state at all. All of that is now handled inside of the slice, and we can just send the raw data that we need to. Now I'll grab Visual Studio Code, drag it to the left, and we can try another post again. So I'll say, hey, and then my, Save the post, and we look here at the bottom and we've got hey, hey, my for the new post. Now the one we created before, of course, isn't there because we've modified the code and saved it, and then of course that is removed. But overall, everything is working as we expect. Now this is a good time to also bring up that there is such a thing as Redux DevTools. So let me grab that link for you, and then I'll bring it over here and put it in a new tab. And if we go to Redux DevTools, this is the GitHub page, and I'll link to this in the description, we can see that Redux DevTools is a browser extension. It's available for Chrome, Edge, and Firefox, also as a standalone app or even a React component. And it's a pretty good way to check your state and make sure things are working as you expect them to inside of your app. So I'll open up DevTools, and then after you've installed that, I'm in Chrome, I'll go down here to Redux, select that, and we can see here's our raw state. It's a tree right now that we're looking at. If I drag this up a little, I'm not so sure I can do that. I've got a shorter screen sometimes. So there we go. I've got the posts, and each one of these are showing in a tree. You can also see a chart, and of course it'd be nice to have a little more room to see the chart, but I'm shrinking it with the scroll wheel, and there we can see it. It's pretty simple right now because we have a simple state. And then we can see it raw. So here we can actually see each post inside of our raw. And then you can also see the difference. So you can see the last action that was called into action, essentially. And I'm trying to find something to drag here, but I don't see anything to make this bigger for you on my screen currently. If I were to shrink my font and everything, as far as my zoom, it would probably be easier to see. But anyway, all of this is there. You can install Redux DevTools as a Chrome extension or whatever browser you're using. It looks like it's available for Edge and Firefox as well, a React component or a standalone application. And this might help you as you work with Redux. So I definitely wanted to mention it. I'm going to close DevTools now and drag the browser back over here to the right. I'll drag Visual Studio Code back to full screen display. And now we want to add users to the application so we can credit the posts to their authors. But we want to keep this as a separate feature. So we want to separate all the logic and data from the post slice, and we'll create a new feature called users. So inside of our features directory, let's create another directory here called users. And I'm on the wrong keys. There we go. Users. And then inside of users, we'll create a users slice. So again, users slice.js. Now inside of users slice, we're going to import create slice. There it is in our list. And we get that from Redux Toolkit. And then I'm going to paste in the rest, and we'll quickly go over it as well. You can see once again, I've just got a hard-coded initial state here with 3 users. And then the user slice has a name. It gets the initial state, and right now the reducers are empty. Notice I already created a select all users selector here that we can export, and then we're exporting the default user slice.reducer. So we need to put that in the store, which will be our next stop. So let's go to the store.js, and now at the top here we'll say import users reducer. And that will come from, again, 2 dots, features, now users, and there inside we'll find our users slice. And here we'll just put it after the post reducer. So we'll put a comma and then users, and we'll have our users reducer. So now when posts are made, we want to go ahead and add the user ID to the post, so then we can look up the username and of course give them credit with the post. So let's go back to the post slice. And there we need to go ahead and change this prepare to also accept a user ID. So we'll put user ID right here, and then we're of course going to put that inside of the payload as well. So here we'll just have user ID. And now to send this user ID data to the prepare function, we need to go back where it is coming from, and that is the add post form. So at the top, we're going to do a couple of things. We've got use dispatch. Let's go ahead and bring in the use selector. And now, of course, you can see we changed our code earlier when we simplified it with that prepare function in the slice. So we don't need the nano ID here anymore. We can remove that import. But then underneath our import of post added, let's go ahead and import. And here it will be the select all users, and that comes from our user slice. Okay, now that we have that, we also need to have some more temporary state. So we could just press Shift Alt and the down arrow to copy down the content state, and we'll select content here and change this to users and set users. Or do I want user ID? I want user ID there. So let me select both users and say user ID. That looks better. So that's a temporary state that we will track here in the component, and we will pass along with whatever the post is then to the global state. Now we need to go ahead and get our users. So here we'll say const users, and let's set this equal to the use selector that we imported. And then inside of there, we'll use the select all users. And there we'll save. Oh, I left off the S. There it is, and now save. Now, just like we added to the state where we have user ID, we're going to need a content changed here as well. So we'll take this down, and we can change this. Instead of on content changed, let's call this on author changed. And then inside of that on author changed, instead of set author here, which would also make sense, we're going to set user ID. And I noticed I left a T there in the author. So there we go. Now on author changed. Now inside of our dispatch with the post added, we're going to have the title, content, and the user ID to send as well. Okay, underneath the on save post clicked, I'm going to go ahead and create the options menu right here called user options. So let's quickly look at this. We're mapping over the users we brought in, and then we're using an option element to have a key and a value, and then we display the user name. But of course, the value that we are sending is that user ID. And that's what we will grab with our on author changed that sets the user ID here. And then we send that user ID state that we set above right here to our post added function. So now let's add those options to our form, and I'm going to put them between the title and the content, I believe. So we'll just put it right here and paste that in. We'll get it reformatted, but you can see we have a label for the select element. And then, of course, the options here go inside, but we're starting out with one blank option as well. Now, there's one more thing we can do for this form, so I'm going to scroll back up, and just above user options here, I'll paste this in. We're defining can save, and we're essentially checking to see if the title, the content, and the user ID are all true right here. And if that is true, then, if can save is true, we can enable or disable the form button. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll scroll down here and let's look at the different attributes for the button, and we'll set this last one to disabled, which disabled would be true if you could not click the button. So what we want to do is say the opposite of can save. So if can save is true, then disabled is false, and save our file. And now we should be able to see how this works. So I'll quickly drag Visual Studio Code to the left, and you can see our button is disabled. But now if we put in the post title and I say my rug, and then here I'll choose Dude Lebowski, and then I can say they took my rug, and you can see as soon as we have content in all three of these, the button is enabled. But if we remove the content, the button is not working. So that's the goal we wanted there. Now we're sending the user ID from our form as we dispatch our post added right here, our post added function. So we're sending all this back to the prepare callback that then gets added as a payload. But what we haven't done yet is set anything to actually display the author. So we need to do that next, and we'll do that by creating a new component inside of the posts feature. So here we go, and let's call this post author.js. We'll start at the top by importing the use selector, and after we get use selector, we also want to import select all users. And now after we have both of those, I'm going to use RAFCE once again, press tab, and we get a post author component. This is a simple component. Once again, I'll remove what is inside of it and just paste in some of the logic here. So we've got our users, and we're using the use selector with our select all users selector that we created in the slice. And now we're defining author. And here we call the find array method on users, and we're just finding the author. So once we get the author, if he exists, he or she, I should say, then we display the name. But if the author doesn't exist or just isn't there at all, I guess if you can't find the number or one hasn't been provided, then we get unknown author. And that's a very simple component. So let's go ahead and save. Now let's go to the post list and import this component. So here we'll say import post author, and I see it popping up in our list. And then once we've got the post author, we'll put it below the title and the content. And I've got just a little bit of formatting here, so I'll save. I can remove that empty line if we want. But what I've got is a paragraph, and I applied a class called post credit, and now we have our post author component, and you can see the user ID is passed from the post.user, and this needs to be user ID right here. There we go, and save. Now we'll look at the results in just a second, but now if we go back and look at our post slice, remember our initial state. We didn't provide a user ID here. We have a post ID, a title, and a content. So let's see what happens with that, as well as any new post we create that should have a user ID. So I'm going to drag this to the left, and I've got a user ID problem here in the post author we just created. So I think I know what it is. And yes, we forgot to pass it in up here. So this is really what we need to destructure and have the user ID to receive the prop that is being passed in. So we put that, pass it into the post author, and all should be good. Let's go back and look at the post list once again where that is passed in. And so here we go. User ID is being passed in, so we needed to receive it. And that's what was missing. Okay, dragging this back to the left, we're all good to go here. We've got Dude Lebowski. He's saying, hey, what about my rug? And then he says, this aggression will not stand. And save the post. Let's take a look. And look, we've got an unknown author for the first two because remember our initial state doesn't even provide that user ID. So it just defaults to unknown author instead. But on the last one, we can see the author is now getting credit. Now it would be nice if we could also display the time the post was made in a user-friendly way here right beside the author. So let's do that next. I'll drag this back and we'll have Visual Studio Code in the full screen. And this will be part of the post data. So we'll once again go back to the post slice, and I'll hide the file tree again. And we can make some changes here. Now the first thing we're going to need to do is import a dependency. So I'll press Control and the backtick. I'm going to exit right now for the application, and then we could type npm I. We're going to install, and then it's date-fns. And we'll install this date-fns package that will help us display the date in a friendly way for users. And with that completed, we can close the terminal, and we'll have to restart the app in just a minute. But right now, we'll go to the top, and we'll import sub from date-fns. Okay, we've got sub imported, and now we need to add the date to our initial state. So we'll break these out on separate lines here now. And now for the last part, we'll put in the date, and here we'll have date. And let me break this onto another line. And I'll click up here and I'll just paste this in real quick, but you can see we're using sub. So we're taking a new date object, and then we're essentially subtracting 10 minutes. And then we're also converting this to a string. We could remove the comma for now if we want to. But this is how we're storing the data, as this ISO string. So it's converting to a timestamp string. And let's go ahead and do the same thing now to our other post. And I'll put a comma here and come down to the next line and have date. And we'll break that down to another line. But here I'll once again paste in the sub. And instead of 10 minutes here, we'll make it 5 minutes. So they have different values, and save this much. But before we're finished, we also need to add this to the prepare. Now this isn't something that's going to get passed in like title, content, and user ID. We can just put it here inside of the content. So we'll go ahead and put it right here, and then I'll just paste it, but it's date. And then we're taking whatever the new date is and converting it to that timestamp string. So essentially right when the post is made, we're creating a timestamp. I'll save this change, and then back in the file tree, we need to create another new component, and we'll call this one time ago. and there I started with the T, there we go, timeago.js. And now inside of timeago, we'll start with an import. So we're going to import, and this will be parse ISO, and then we're also going to import format distance to now. And both of those are going to come from date-fns. After we've done that, we can go ahead and use RAFCE again if you have ES7 snippets installed as the extension, and there we get our timeago component. Going to try to avoid the mistake I made before with the post author, and remember to pass in the timestamp here at the beginning. After that, inside the component, I'll just paste in what we've got. Fairly simple again. So we start out with a timeago variable that is empty, and now if we have the timestamp, we're going to go ahead and create the date. We're going to parse that ISO that we created, parse the timestamp. And then we also get the time period with the format distance to now. And then we set our timeago to time period ago. So it's a user-friendly way to read the date. And then we're just returning that right here. So let's save this and head back to the post list where we can import this. So just like we imported post author, we'll import timeago. And that is not what I wanted. I got the wrong tab there. So I'll try that again. Import timeago. And there it is. And now we can put it right underneath our post author. So I'll copy that line down, change that to timeago. And then this is going to be timestamp right here. And inside of timestamp, whoa, got a little extra. Inside of timestamp, we're going to put the post.date, and that's what gets passed in. Now we need to restart our app to look at these changes. So once again, I'll do npm start, and we'll get that going. I'll drag Visual Studio Code to the left. There we go. We've got everything compiled, and let's take a look. So we've got unknown author 10 minutes ago, unknown author 5 minutes ago. Let's try a new post again. We'll say, hey, and then Neil Young, and now we can say my, save the post, and let's look at the bottom. Less than a minute ago. So that is also working as we expect it to. But as we look at this, wouldn't it be nice to see the new post we made show up here at the top instead of the bottom? So we can see that new post right away. Let's make the changes that will make that happen. So let's drag Visual Studio Code back. I'll close the terminal. And now inside of our post list, I'll paste a line of code, and I bet yes, I'll need to hide that file tree again with Control B. So let's look at the ordered post that we're defining. We're taking all of the posts, and then let's look at this in reverse order. So we're sorting the posts, and this locale compare will return a -1 or a +1 or a 0 based on if one is greater than the other. So it converts that date string, and it lets our sort method here, or sort function, handle this A-B comparison. So then we're sorting all of the posts by the date string. Slice is going to return a shallow copy of the array. So we're essentially creating a new array then, and that's what we're storing in ordered posts. So with that change, I need to select ordered posts, and I'll get rid of this extra line. So we're not going to map over posts anymore here. We're going to map over the ordered posts. And now let's save. And once again, I'll drag Visual Studio Code to the left. Let's look at everything. And hey, our Neil Young post is still there, but it's on top now. So 12 minutes ago, 7 minutes ago, 2 minutes ago, and you can see that things are now in that reverse order that we need. So the most recent post is on top. These posts look okay, but I think they would be better if we could actually add reactions for the posts as well. So let's do that. I'll pull Visual Studio Code back over so we can see it in the full window. And we're at the posts list right now. We need to go back to the post slice, because anytime we add new data, that is the first place to think about. What data are we dealing with? It still deals with the post. So this is where we'll go. And in our initial state again, for the 2 posts that we have in here, let's go ahead and add the reactions here first. So it will be an object. So we've got our reactions object, and now we've got 5 different options. So we'll have 5 different reaction buttons. And let's do the same thing for the second post. And we can save that, but then we also need to handle this in that prepare function as well. So any new post that is created needs to be prepared and have these same reaction options as well. So this will go ahead and add the reactions to any new post. And now we need to add a new reducer that will actually update the reaction count when a user clicks any of these buttons. So here we are in the reducers, and we've got post added that has a reducer and a prepare. So let's just follow this down to the bottom, and after post added, we'll put a comma, and I'll paste in our new reducer here, which is reaction added, and it receives the state and the action. And then we're going to deconstruct the post ID and the reaction from the action payload, and there we'll have the existing post, and then we will find what the post is from the post ID, and we'll update the reaction count. Once again, notice this would normally be mutating the state as we just increased that, but because we're in the create slice, this is handled by Emmer.js, and that lets us write code like this that would normally mutate the state, but underneath the hood, Emmer is making sure we are not mutating the state. Remember, once again, you can only do this inside of the create slice. Okay, now remember, once we've added this new reducer here, reaction added, then Redux Toolkit automatically creates that action creator that we need to export to use in the component. So then after our post added action creator, we're also going to export reaction added, and that comes from the post slice.actions. Now, just like we did with post author and our time ago component, we need to create a reaction buttons component. So let's do that. Reaction buttons.js. Now at the top of reaction buttons, we're going to import use dispatch. And after use dispatch, we're also going to import reaction added. And we got that from the post slice. And now let's go ahead and paste our reaction emoji. It looks like I missed the C in const when I copied that. So we have our reaction emoji object now, and this provides a object lookup. So we have thumbs here, thumbs up as the key, and then we have the emoji as the value on the right, and that follows that same structure. Now I'm going to come down here and use RAFCE, and that creates our simple component here at first for reaction buttons. Now once again, we're going to receive something, and that will be the post. And then inside of the component, I'll paste in the body here, and we can go over it quickly, hide the file tree so you can see it all. So we've got the post, and here we're creating the dispatch, and then the reaction buttons. Well, it's an object lookup that we have up here, right, that receives the reaction emoji. So we say object.entries, and then we pass in that reaction emoji, which allows us to map over everything. The key is the name, and then the emoji is the value. So now once here inside of the JSX that we're returning, we can refer to the name, and then later on we can refer to the emoji as well. Besides that, we're receiving the post in the component. So here we can dispatch reaction added and pass in that post ID and the reaction that we expect to receive back in the post slice where we have the reducer. And to finish out the component, we see we're going to return a div that contains our reaction buttons JSX that we created here. And of course we have the default at the bottom. Now we need to go back to the post list and import this. So here we go. We'll import reaction buttons from reaction buttons. There it is. And now inside of our article, inside of the JSX, we can use this component, reaction buttons, and now it's going to receive the full post. So we just pass in the post, not posts, but post, the individual one. And we can save. And now let's go back and look at our application once again. I'll drag this to the left, and you can see we've got reaction emojis here for each post. And I could even make another new one. I can say, hey, hey, where's my rug? That is a reference to the Big Lebowski movie, by the way, if you're not familiar. So here we go. We've got our posts. We can say thumbs up. Everybody's supporting the dude wanting his rug. And everything is keeping count like it should. Looks good. And now if we add one more post, my, from Neil Young, hey, hey. We add that. Let's look, and yes, we've still got the count here for Dude Lebowski's post and for our unknown post. So all the reaction emojis are now working as well. So I hope overall this has been a very good exercise for learning about the structure and data flow used in Redux Toolkit. Redux does everything synchronously, so anything asynchronous has to happen outside the store. And this is where Redux middleware comes in. And the most common async middleware is Redux Thunk. Thunks are recommended as the standard approach for writing async logic with Redux. So what does thunk mean? The word thunk is a programming term that means a piece of code that does some delayed work, and that description really fits asynchronous tasks. We're going to jump right in from where we left off in part 2 of this Redux Toolkit series. We created an example bulletin board project in React with Redux Toolkit. You can download this starter code from the sources in the description, or you can create your own. I've got Visual Studio Code open, and our starting point today is in the posts slice, which is inside of the source directory, and then inside of the features directory, and finally inside of the posts directory, and then you find the posts slice.js. What we want to do is remove our initial state that we started with. We were using a static state, and now we're going to bring in data from an API server. So we'll grab all of this initial state and redefine it. Actually, I'll just paste it in so I also have the initial state const there. So we'll remove all of this just with the backspace. And now I'll paste in what we're going to have for our state. Oh, and I missed the C on const. So let me add that and now expand this once again. There we go. So now we've got our initial state and we've got an object now. And so posts is an empty array because we haven't populated or hydrated that yet, if you will. And then the status is set to idle. And notice I've got a comment here because these are the different values we're going to use, either idle, loading, succeeded, or failed. And then we've got a spot to hold an error if we do receive one. And we just set that to null to start out. And now we need to consider that our initial state has changed, and since it's an object, it is no longer just going to be state.posts. We actually have a posts property. So we need to change what we have here. So let's find the different references to state, and I'm going to do that by pressing Control D. Actually, I want to press Control F to find the first one. And I'll then search for state and then a dot after. And you can see I found the first one and it says there are 3. So now I can just highlight the first one, state dot, and I'll press Control D to select the next one and the next one. And we're going to change all of these. So I'll press the right arrow to go to the end. And we need to add posts after this. So then we'll add posts and a dot actually, so everything works. And I know that makes it look a little weird because we have state.posts.posts, but that's what it ends up being because we now have an object, and then we also have the name here inside of our slice that is posts. So we have state.posts.post when we refer to that inside of our selector here with select all posts. Other than that, we should also have state.posts.find inside of the reaction added, and then we should have state.posts.push inside of the post added reducer. And an important footnote here, this is why we created this selector, the select all posts, because imagine if the shape of our state had changed and we were referring to the state directly, such as state.posts, inside of each component. We would have to go into every one and make that change. But because we used the select all posts and exported that, now when the shape of the state changed, we only needed to change it here inside of the slice. And now we want to create our async thunk right here inside of the slice file. So let's go ahead and import that at the top, and we're currently importing create slice and nano ID. So now let's add create async thunk right there for an import. And I also want to define a base URL here. So I'm going to put in a posts URL. And then I also want to import Axios. And so let's check our package to see if we even have Axios. I don't think we do yet, so we may need to add that dependency. No, we don't have Axios yet. So let's control backtick and say npm I Axios and install the Axios dependency so we can use it inside of our async thunk. It installed very quickly. We now have Axios here inside of our dependencies in the package JSON. I'll go back to the post slice and let's also import Axios. Okay, with that import complete, I'm just going to put a space there between the imports and the definition of our post URL. I'm now going to show you the async thunk that we are creating here, and it is fetch post. So I just pasted that in, and let's break this down now. So here's fetch post, and it uses create async thunk. Now create async thunk accepts two arguments. So the first one is a string that's used as the prefix for the generated action type. And the second is a payload creator callback. And this function should return a promise that contains some data or a rejected promise with an error. And you can see inside the callback, which is async, we are using Axios in a try-catch block. So we are requesting information from the post URL, and then we're getting that response data. And I'm just spreading it into a new array right here. And then, of course, we have a catch, which could be an error message that we return as well. And note that we are getting our data from JSON placeholder.typecode.com/posts. And this is a nice fake API that does accept post requests and GET requests. And so we'll be able to send data to it and get a response as well. So it just kind of helps us develop this application. Now in our post slice, we have a reducer here where we have created the slice, and here's the reducers. But sometimes a slice reducer needs to respond to other actions that weren't defined as part of the slice's reducers. And that is kind of like what happens here with our async thunk fetch post. So let's go ahead and add an extra reducers function that is supported. So we can put a comma here, and after that we say extra reducers, and this accepts a builder parameter. And this builder parameter is an object that lets us define additional case reducers that run in response to the actions defined outside of the slice. So I'm going to paste this in, and then we'll break it down. I'll probably need to scroll just a little bit. Actually, it fills more than the screen, so we'll break it down bit by bit. So here the cases are listening for the promise status action types that are dispatched by the fetch posts thunk. And then we respond by setting our state accordingly. So let's look at each one. A promise could be pending. So then we respond by setting our status to loading. And then a promise, of course, could be fulfilled. And if that's the case, we set the status to succeeded. But then we're also going ahead and returning some information here. So what we're doing is saying, let 1 minute, we're defining this minute variable. Then we're looking at the loaded posts that we get from the action payload, and we map over each one of those because our fake API doesn't have a couple of the areas of data that we need, and one was the date that we were using. So we're just setting the date with the sub function from datefns that we had previously imported, and we're increasing the minutes for each post, and that way they don't have the same time ago set or timestamp. And then we also have reactions, and those aren't coming from the API either. So I just needed to add those here, and then we return that post. But essentially we get the loaded posts from the action payload. And then we once again add those loaded posts to our state. And here's the state.post.concat. Now also realize this is still inside the slice, which uses immer.js underneath the hood or in the background. So we're doing things like concat and like adding minutes here that we wouldn't normally do because it would mutate the state. But inside of the create slice with immer.js, that is how we do it. And then immer.js handles it and makes sure it is not a mutation. And then of course we also have the rejected possibility here, and then we would set the status to failed and set our error message. So this looks a little like a switch case statement, but it's based on the builder. And then we have an .add case for each one of these possibilities here. And this is all inside of the extra reducers. So it's handling something that did not get defined inside of the normal reducers part of the slice. And now we need to save and move on to the posts list component. Okay, inside of posts list, we need to go ahead and add to our imports. So we not only have use selector, we also want use dispatch here. And after use dispatch, we also need to go ahead and import use effect from React. So let's add that as well. There it is. Let me tab down. There we go. And now I've added a space here because we're going to change some things here, but I also realized something. Besides select all posts, let's go ahead and add some other selectors for our state. So back in the post slice, if we scroll back up and look at our state, we also had the status and the error. So let's add selectors for those as well so we can pull all of those in. So here after the select all posts, I'm just going to press Shift Alt and the down arrow, and it's going to duplicate that on 2 other lines. Let's call this one get posts status. And so this would be state.posts.status. And then the next one we'll call get posts error, and this would be state.posts.error. And now we can import those as well. So let's go back to the post list, and after select all posts, we're also going to have get posts status, get posts error, and we can't forget our fetch posts. When it was created in the slice, it was an export const, so we just had it listed above where it's created. Just like we have an export const here, it was just defined above the slice, so we can also export that. So back in the post list, we are now importing select all posts, get post status, get post error, and fetch posts. Let me hide the file tree so we can see all of that. We've also got use effect from React, and then use selector and use dispatch from React Redux. Okay, let's move inside the post list component now. And the first thing we'll do is define dispatch. So we'll say const dispatch. We'll set that equal to use dispatch. After that, we're going to work with our selectors here. So we have posts already. Let's go ahead and copy this down. And so besides posts, we're also going to have posts status, and we'll set this equal to the get post status, of course inside of the use selector. And I need an S there to make it look right. There we go. And then we'll also have a possible error. Oop, I didn't get that selected. There we go. So we'll just set error equal to get posts error. And now, of course, they've turned the proper colors because we're matching up with what we imported above. Now, after these selectors, I'm going to go ahead and paste in the use effect. I'll save to get some proper formatting. But let's look at this use effect. So we're checking the post status, and we're seeing if it is idle. And then if it's idle, we're dispatching the fetch posts async thunk. So here inside of the dependency, you can see we're checking post status, and we have the dispatch also listed because those are defined here inside of the component. Now we're using fetch posts here, but that's imported above, so we don't need to worry about putting that there. And now we want to display the loading state in our post list, and we're going to start by extracting some of the post list component into a separate component called posts excerpt. So I'll go to the file tree, and just inside of our posts directory here, we can create a new file. This is going to be called posts excerpt.js. And then inside of this, I can type RAFCE, press tab, and we get our posts excerpt component. Now it's going to receive a post, so I don't want to forget to add that right away. But now let's look at the imports it needs. And back inside of posts list, we can just see what we need right here, these 3. So we did have those in this component. I'm going to press Control X to cut those out and put them instead at the top of posts excerpt. So I'll just paste those in and leave a line. And it looks like I left a line at the top. There we go. And now if I jump back to the posts list and I scroll down, we can just grab this article that we have here inside of our rendered posts definition where we were mapping through the ordered posts. Once again, press Control X to just pull those out of the posts list, and we can replace this div here that is by default and paste in our article and save. There's one short change we need to make, and we will not be putting the key right here. This will go inside of where we place the component in post list. So I removed the key from the article, and we can save this component, and now we can import it into post list. So we'll switch back here, scroll back to the top, and we should be able to import posts excerpt. There it is in the list. press tab, and we now have it where we can use it inside of the post list component. And now let's change some of our logic here inside of post list so we can actually display the isLoading state if we need to. I'll press Control B to hide that file tree. So we're looking at the ordered posts and rendered posts here. And I'm just going to replace both of these, and I will paste in the new code, and then we'll take a look at that. Now let's go ahead and remove the problem code that we see here as well. And let's see what we've got. We've got let content. So we've got a content variable to start out with, which we're defining as we go through this if, else if logical conditional here. So we're checking the post status. And if it is loading, then we're just going to say loading. And if you had a spinner component, this would be a good place for it as well. Else if our post status has succeeded, then we're going to define the ordered post that we had before. And this looks much the same, where we sort them based on the date. And then we set our content equal to the ordered post that we're going to map over. And now here is our new posts excerpt component. And you can see I'm now providing the key here as we go through the map, and then of course use the component for each different post that we have. And we're also passing in the post that that component receives. And our final one, of course, is the failed status, and then we set the content to the error so that can be displayed. And because of this change, we also need to change rendered post now to our content variable inside the JSX. And this seems like it would be a good time to test out our application. So I'm going to press Control backtick, type npm start, and fire up React. Now I'm going to pull Visual Studio Code over to the left as this works, and we should see our React app here on the right as soon as the development server gets it up and running. And as I oftentimes do, I have an error. It looks like we're referring to post status here, and I bet I put post status with an extra S up above, and I sure did. So we could change all of those, or we could just change this one here. So what I will do is just make that post status and save, and now we should see our application. Instead, we've got a blank page. So let's check out what's going on here by looking at the dev tools, Shift Control I, and yes, we definitely have an error. Let's see what it is. We are not reading undefined, so something is going wrong. Let's look here. It occurred in post excerpt. And so there is an issue, at least with the content. So let's look at the substring we're referencing in the post excerpt. I'll grab this, drag it back to the right. We go to the post excerpt component, and here's substring, and I see it's referencing content, but our API delivers the content in the post.body. So if I save that, we should be good, and we are. So now we have our form here at the top as we created in part 2 of this tutorial series. But let's look at all of these posts that we're bringing in. And they have lorem ipsum from the JSON typecode website, or JSON placeholder website. And we can see we're getting lots and lots of posts. We should actually have 100 if I were to scroll here through all of these. So yeah, we've got all the posts and everything is coming in as we expect it to. But there is one thing about these posts. They have unknown authors. So right now, we also want to go ahead and grab the users from the API so it matches up to the posts, and then our posts will actually have authors instead of unknown authors. I'll leave our React app running here to the right, but I'm going to go ahead and pull Visual Studio Code over so it takes up the full screen again. We'll follow a very similar pattern that we did with the post slice, but now let's go to the file tree and collapse the posts and go into users and select the users slice. We'll want to import or create async thunk again. So we have create async thunk. After that, we're also going to want to import Axios, which we do now have as a dependency already. So there is our Axios. And after that, we're going to want to define a URL again, and I'll just paste that in. This is our users URL. It comes from the same API, but it is /users. And yes, we could create an Axios instance and set a base URL and then import that as well. I did not do that for this tutorial, but it's something you absolutely could do. We're going to set the initial state now, remove our static state, and just set it to an empty array as well. And now I'm going to paste in our async thunk, and it is much like our fetch post was. So I'll hide the file tree so we can get a better look, but we've got fetch users instead of fetch posts. Once again, create async thunk. It has this description here to start out with that follows the same pattern. We named the slice and then we named the function. And then here's the callback. And once again, we're getting the users. I'm returning the response data inside of a new array. And it returns an error message if we get that, all inside of a try catch block. So very, very close to our fetch posts async thunk. And because it is an async thunk and happens outside of the slice, we once again need to supply something inside of the slice to handle that, and that is the extra reducer section. So I'll paste that in and save, and we can see it once again receives a builder. In this instance, we're only looking for one case. So our add case is looking for fetch users dot fulfilled. And then, of course, the action is the action payload. And here we're returning the action payload. And that means it replaces the user state completely. It was an empty array, of course. But we could have used something like state.push and then spread in this payload. And that would be something that Immer.js would also handle. But by returning the payload without the push at all, that means we are completely overriding the state, and it also means we're not going to accidentally add in the users twice or something like that. So we're just returning the full action payload here. And now we want to dispatch our fetch users async thunk. And this is going to be a little different than we did before. So let's go to the file tree, and we actually want to go directly to the index.js. And that is because we want to load the users right when the app starts. So what we can do is first import our fetch users. There it is. And after we get that, of course, it's going to come from .features and then slash users slash user slice. There we go. And then we're going to just say store.dispatch and then call fetch users. We want this immediately when the application loads. And we can do this because we have access to the store right there. Okay, with these changes saved, let's drag Visual Studio Code back to the left, and now let's look at our application. And you can see we now have Leanne Graham listed here as an author instead of an unknown author. And Leanne should be the author for the first 10 posts, and then it should switch to another author. So I'll scroll down. Yes, our next author is Irvin Howell. Of course, the way this API data works, he'll have the next 10 posts and so on. But we should have 10 different authors, and we should be able to see those authors now in our drop-down list here for author. So yes, we do. There they all are. We have the different authors listed from the API. So now our last adjustment to this project is to change how we add a new post. So to do that, let's go back to Visual Studio Code. I'll make it take up the full window once again. We need to go back to the post slice and handle new posts. Now, as you might guess, inside the post slice, this is going to take a new async thunk. So I'll paste it right below our fetch posts and we can break it down. Wait a minute. There we go. And I'll save. And I'll press Control B to hide the file tree again. Let's look at our new async thunk here called add new post. So once again, it's named post/add new post. Here is the async callback. Notice it receives initial post data. And so this will be the body of the post request that we send to Axios. And then we once again get that response data. Now this will just be one record, and we know that. It will not be an array like we might have expected when we got all of the posts. And then of course in our builders case below, under the extra reducers, we need to add a case for our new post. So here we have our extra reducers and the builder. We have the case for fetch posts, pending, fulfilled, and also rejected. So then let's add one more case below. And I'll save. If we can get proper formatting, it would help. Let me get rid of that space. There we go. So now we've got new post, and we're just looking at fulfilled again. Once again, since the API does not have some of the extra data that we've been using, I'm adding that here with the date and the reactions. And now I'm even logging to the console the payload, so if you want to see that. However, we're getting the user ID here, and the API provides the user ID I believe, as a string. So we're just converting that to number as well. And then we're pushing that action payload to the array. Once again, we're still inside of create slice, so Ember.js is under the hood, and we can use push here like would normally mutate state, but remember Ember.js handles that underneath and it will not. So this is the correct way to do this inside of the create slice only. So now let's save the slice and go back to the file tree because we need to go to our add post form component. I'll press Ctrl B again to hide the file tree, and we need to replace our post added that we are importing with our add new post thunk that we created. Let's also add some extra state where we're going to look at the state, or the status actually. So add request status and set add request status, and we'll start that out as idle. And now that we have that new state to work with, let's scroll down. I believe underneath the on save post clicked, yes, we've got this can save variable. Let's put this above, so I'm just going to press Ctrl X and then come up here above the on save post clicked function, and there we'll put our can save because we're going to change it a little bit. So right now we're checking to see if the title, the content, and the user ID are true before the button can be clicked on the form. Let's refactor this so it looks just a little different, and we'll also take into account our request status. So I will paste this over to change it, and now you can see we're still checking the title, content, and user ID, but we've put them in an array, and we're using every and then passing in Boolean there. So once again, it is just checking to see if all of these are true, but it is refactored, and I kind of like how that looks. After that, we've got the double ampersand, so then we're also checking to make sure that the add request status state is idle before we can click the can save or the save button, and this is just verifying that we can save. And now let's scroll up just a little bit. We're going to change the body of our on save post clicked. So I'll just highlight what's inside and paste this in, and we'll break it down. So we are checking the status now of can save as well. Then we have a try, catch, finally. So we start out by setting our request status to pending instead of idle, and at the end, in the finally, no matter if there's an error or not, it is always going to set it back to idle. So that helps us work with our button there. And then of course we're calling dispatch here and dispatching the add new post thunk that we created, and we're passing in the title, and here we have the body, and then that is the content, and then the user ID. Redux Toolkit adds an unwrap function to the returned promise, and then that returns a new promise that either has the action payload or it throws an error if it's the rejected action. So that lets us use this try catch logic here, so it will throw an error if it is rejected. And then we're just emptying out our state as we were before after this process is complete. So now we can save this form and we should be finished. Let's test out the app once again, and we can try to add a new post. So I'll just say, hey there, and let's attribute this to Leanne, and we'll just say, hey there, hello. And we save, and we've of course sorted in reverse order, so our new post is the first one here. It's from Leanne Graham, and there's the new post, and we still have all the other posts as well. So now we have taken this project and made it interact with an API to not only retrieve data, but to post new data using async thunks to complete asynchronous actions with Redux. A quick correction. Sometimes I get to the end of making a video and notice a mistake. This is a small one, but I do want to fix it. We didn't do anything with the emojis today, so I really didn't notice they were off. But notice we don't even have a number by each emoji. So if I click coffee, it gives me the not a number. So I knew something was up once I discovered this. What we want to do is just go into the post slice, and I just put in the wrong names when I put in the new reducer. So here are the correct names. We have thumbs up, wow, heart, rocket, and coffee. Let me just copy those with the zeros here. And in the extra reducers now for our async thunk, we want to replace these where there's the hooray and the eyes and just some different ones that we didn't have. So if I highlight those, save, and then of course we're going to reload our application. And now we have a 0 by each emoji, and they'll all continue to count correctly. So what was missing were the correct reaction names inside of our add case for the fetch post.fulfilled in the extra reducers. Just a quick correction there. Everything else seems good. Let's build a blog app as an example React and Redux Toolkit project. And our blog project will support all CRUD operations when we create, read, update, and delete blog posts. We're going to jump right in where we left off in part 3 of this Redux Toolkit series, and we created an example bulletin board project in React with Redux Toolkit. And today we're going to refactor this single page application into a multi-page blog. And you can download the starter code that I'm starting with from the sources in the description. Okay, we're here at the app.js, and you can see we've just got this single page application. We're pulling in an add post form component and a post list component, and they all display at the same time. If you run the code right now, the form is on top and then the post list is just underneath. So it's really a bulletin board single page application. We're going to change this into a multi-page blog, and we're going to start by adding a single page that we can view just one post at a time and view the full page and not an excerpt, but the entire post, I should say, the full post. So what we want to do is first go into the post slice that's in our features directory, and here we're going to add a selector to select a post by ID. We've already created some selectors at the bottom, so let's go see those. So down here at the bottom of the post sliced, we have select all posts, get post status, and get posts error. And you can see they're very simple. They receive the state, and then they either return all the posts, the status, or the error that we have in the initial state where we set that up, and that's way up above. If I scroll back up, here's the initial state with post, status, and error. But now we want to just get one single post, and we'll do that with the post ID. So I'm going to grab that quickly and paste it in, and we'll review. So right underneath, I'm pasting in this new selector, and you can see select post by ID. It receives not only the state, but a post ID. And then once again, we're referring to the posts, and yes, it's state.posts.posts here, but we are finding then the post by the post ID where they match. Okay, we're exporting this selector as well, so I'm going to save this page, and now still in the posts directory here that's in the features directory, which is in the source directory. So here we are at posts. I'm going to create a new component. So I'm going to hit the new icon up there, and we'll call this single post page.js. Now this is going to let us view the full post, and it's going to look a lot like our post excerpt component that we have here, but notice we're only viewing the first 100 characters right now, and we're passing in the post. This is going to get the post in a different way using that selector. So let's go back to the single page post. I'm going to paste this in and we can review. So I will scroll to the top. Notice we're importing in use selector, and then we're importing in the selector that we just created. We also have the post author, time ago, and reaction buttons related to the post as well, because that will let us view those. Now, I've made a comment here because we haven't retrieved the post ID yet. We're going to do that soon as we implement React Router, and we'll get it from a parameter. But right now, if we had the post, then we're going to go ahead, or at least the post ID, if we had the post ID, then we're going to go ahead and use our selector and pass in the post ID. Now this selector is different because it accepts the two parameters, state and the post ID. So notice we're not just passing in our selector by name. We actually need to have an anonymous function here that passes in the state, and then we can pass in the state as well as the post ID to the selector here. After this, if the post is not found, we're going to return a section element with an H2 that simply says post not found. However, if it is found, then we're going to return the post, and it looks much like the post excerpt, except it's not limited to the first 100 characters. It will be the full post. With that complete, I'll save this file, and now I'm going to press Control and the back tick, and we'll also scroll down here and pull up our package.json so we can see our dependencies. And we see in our dependencies right here that we do not currently have React Router, and we're going to need that for a multi-page blog. So we need to type in npm I and then react-router-dom. Press enter. It should install quickly, and then we'll verify that it's listed in our dependencies. All right, the install is already complete, and we now have React Router DOM 6.3 as of the making of this tutorial listed in our dependencies. So I will go ahead and close out of the terminal and close out of the package.json. Now let's go to the index.js and implement the React Router. Now, I do have a specific tutorial for React Router version 6, so if you're not familiar with that, now would be a good time to pause or just go over to my channel and find that. I'll probably link to it in the description below as well. But the purpose is I'm not going to just be teaching React Router here. You'll see how it's implemented, but I'm not going to slow down just to go over the basics of React Router. So here we're going to import in several things for React Router. We've got browser router as router, so we renamed that. Then we've got routes and a singular route as well. Now notice in the JSX we've got React strict mode, which you could remove. You don't have to have strict mode if you don't want to. Then we've got the provider and then just the app. So we're going to replace just the app here with everything else. The provider can surround what we're going to do with the router because we want to provide the store to the entire application. So I'll just paste the rest of this in and we can see the changes. When I save, it gets formatted correctly. So we start with router, and that is browser router, and we named it router here. Then we have routes, and then we have a single route. Now this path is important because the slash and the asterisk will allow for nested routes when we get to our app.js. And then for the element attribute, we just pass in the app component. And so that's all we need to do in index. So let's save this and move to the app.js file. And really, before we make any changes in the app.js file, I'm going to scroll up, collapse the post directory just so we can see all of this better. And inside of the source directory, I'm going to create a new directory and make a components directory. So this is going to house the components that are more for layout and not associated with posts or users specifically. So inside of this components directory, I'm going to create a new component named layout.js. This component is rather simple, and this strategy was introduced with React Router version 6. We're creating an outlet layout here. So if we had something like a header or a footer, we would also probably include it here in our layout file. Right now we don't, we may in the future, but we're using this outlet, and this outlet represents all of the children. So when we put the layout component into our application, it can then represent all of these children underneath. So we'll save here, and now if we were to have a header or a footer or anything, of course they would always appear with all of the children. Okay, now let's go to the app.js file and apply the routing from React Router. So we have two imports at the top already. We're going to add a few more to that. So I'll paste those in. Now we're importing our single post page. We're also importing our layout, and then we're importing routes and the singular route from React Router DOM. Now let's look at the JSX that we're returning, and of course we already abstracted this main with the class name app to our layout component, so we see that right here as well. So we don't need that repeating here inside this. What I'm going to do is just highlight all of that and paste in the new routing, save, and I'll review this with you. So we have our routes, and what we're defining here is the root route, essentially the path with the slash, and then we pass in that layout component that we created. So it is the parent to everything else here. Now inside of this path, we can have an index element, and so we note that here with the route, index, and the element, and we have post list. So that's really what we want to come up as the home page, is our post list component. And of course, anything else that was applied in the layout will also be part of that. And then we have another route, and that is post. So this would be /post, and the index for that route, so whatever.com/post/ and then the add post form. So we could add a new post if we went to the /post route. And then if we had after the /post, if we had another slash, we could have the post ID parameter, and that would go to the single post page and pull up whatever post ID parameter was in the URL. So here we have two nested routes that are inside of our home route. One is the index and one is the post route. And then the post route has its own index, and then of course a route that will support parameters for each individual post. Okay, with the routing covered, let's go back to our single post page that we started, and we need to allow that page to actually get that post ID. So how we're going to do that, now that we have React Router, is to go ahead and import the use params hook from React Router DOM. And then once we have that imported, we can apply it here inside of the component. I'm going to select this, and I'm going to select the use selector here that we are using and paste over both, because there's one change I want to go over with that use selector. I'm going to press Control B to hide the file tree for now. But here we're using the use params hook to get the post ID. So it's going to pull that value from the URL parameter. And then this use selector, the change I made is wrapping the post ID in number, so we can actually get that accurate comparison back in the post slice when we were finding the post by ID, because otherwise the string and number values would not actually have a strict equals. And there's one more change I want to make before we test out our changes. Let's go to that post excerpt component that is much like our single post page. And here we need to add a new import from React Router. We're importing in link from React Router DOM. And then we're going to change this line where we have the post.body.substring. We're going to limit that substring just a little more to 75 characters, and we applied the class name of excerpt. Now I'm providing some new CSS in the index CSS, and you can download that from the resources if you want to, or you can just apply your own. I'm not going over the CSS today. And finally, let's go ahead and add to the post credit class here, this paragraph we have. We'll go ahead and use the link that we imported from React Router DOM. Now this creates an anchor tag when the HTML is rendered, but notice it's linking to the post path and then the post.id, so we can view the individual posts. So we're just adding a link to each excerpt that will allow us to navigate to the full post. And now let's save our changes and then press Control backtick, and let's test out the application, see if we have any errors or if everything is working as it should. So we typed npm start, and it should start up the server, and here we're going to have a new tab, and our application should start on the right very shortly. We'll probably tweak a little bit of this because it's right up against the left side, and everything else looks as it should though. We've got posts, and each individual post as we come down has its own view post link. Let's see if that's working as well. Yes, we can go to the individual post page as well. Now we would have to currently use the back button to go back, but we will add a header very soon. Let's go back to VS Code. I'll close the terminal, but I'll just leave the app running. And now inside of the components directory, let's add that header component. So it's just header.js. I'll paste this in and we can quickly look. We've got link from React Router again because we have a couple of navigation links, but this should provide a header that we can always see no matter what page we navigate to, which will help us either go back to the home page, which will have the list of post excerpts, or go to the post a new post page, essentially a new blog post. And of course, from the home page, we could click on view post that would take us to the individual post page. And that's where we're eventually going to be able to either edit or delete the post as well. So let's save this. And now we need to go to the post list component. We need to go to the layout component. And here at the top, we'll just import the header. So we'll import header, and it's right in the same directory. So there it is. And now besides the outlet, we're going to actually put the header above the main element. So let's say header and save. And what we are missing, as you see the red here, is a fragment, which would help us out. So let's put in the JSX fragment. And then after this last element, We'll put the closing fragment, save, and it should format correctly. That looks more like I want it to. Now, since we didn't stop the app, let's go ahead and see what changes we can see when I drag this over. Well, this looks better. It doesn't look great, but let's see what it looks like if we drag it to a full page now. And that looks much more like I was expecting. Now, I think we could remove this posts here because it's obvious that these are posts and each one says view post. But overall, this looks good. We could maybe refactor or add some more CSS for a smaller screen. But right now, let's just drag it back over here. And let's go to that post list page and see if we can remove, I'll press Control B, see if we can remove that H2 that says posts. So yes, that looks good. And we'll save that. And now if we also go to the posts excerpt once again, those were H3s. We can now change those to H2s. That header hierarchy is important, and we just removed the H2. So there we go. And it did change the size a little bit. We could change our CSS if we want to for that. But now we have an H1 at the top of the page and an H2 here for each additional post. Okay, let's go back to VS Code now. I'll drag this back to the full screen. And once we're in the full screen, I'll press Control B to see the file tree again. And we want to go back to the single post page component. And inside the single post page component, we want to add a edit button so we can edit each post. So what we want to do first, and I've got an extra line here at the top I can remove, but we want to import something else from React Router DOM, and that's going to be link from React Router DOM. And now as we scroll down, essentially in the same spot we put the view post for the excerpt, we can put the edit post here in our single post page. So now we can save that with the link added. And now, just like we have an add post form page, we're going to create another component here that is going to be edit post form.js. And I'll paste the code in and then we'll review. It's really kind of a hybrid between the single post page, because this is just for one post, and the add post form as well. So it's got a little bit of the ingredients of both, but really nothing new. So we're importing in useState because we're still going to use the useState hook for the local state of the form. Then we've got useDispatch and useSelector that we're bringing in from React Redux. We've got our selectors, select post by ID, and then we're going to bring in an update post that we haven't created yet, but we will be doing that next with the post slice because that is our update in our CRUD. We've got create, read, now we're going to update. And we can, of course, see the create and read already in the post slice that were created in the previous tutorial. Okay, use params, but then I said nothing new. Here is the one new hook that you haven't seen yet from React Router. It's use navigate. We're also bringing that in. And then we're bringing in select all users from our user slice, not our post slice. So now, as we review, we're getting the params because we need that post ID just like we do with the single post page. We're also creating navigate so we can use it later. Then we're using the selector to select post by ID, and we're also using a selector to get all of the users. Then we have our state, and this state is much like you've seen before when we added a new post, and we also have a request status ready to go as we would dispatch that update. And of course we are bringing in the use dispatch hook here, so we put the dispatch here. Now this post with the return when the post is not found has to be after all of the hooks. It cannot be before or you will get an error from React. And as I scroll down, now we have the handlers for when the form input changes, title, content, and author. We have a can save variable, and I'll press Control B so we can see all of that. And this is just like we have in the add new post form as well. So we're making sure there is title, content, and user ID. All of those must be true, and the request status must be idle. And then when we click to save the post, and I'll press Alt-Z so the code wraps so you can see all of it, this is a little different now just because we have more information in the post. When the post is first created, we're pulling in information from our fake API, that JSON placeholder API. And then when we do that and we add a new post to our state, we're adding in the reactions and the date because they didn't previously exist at the API. So it's just something we had to do to adapt. But now that we're updating the post, we need to include all of the information we have except for the date because we'll set a new date. And then we use unwrap, which of course throws an error and lets us go to the catch block if an error happens. And that is something we covered in the previous tutorial as well. But it essentially lets that promise either reject or create an error, and then it represents that here and allows us to use try-catch logic. Here's the navigate we created, which is something new. So after we edit this post, we're going to go back to the individual post page and view the post that has the ID. Now, as we scroll down and get to the JSX, we also have to create user options to once again populate that drop menu, just like when we create a new post, and it will have all the users' names in there. So we could change the author if we want to. And then this form is very much like the add new post form. One change here, though, is we had to provide a default value for the user ID in the select. And that is because the post already has an author. So we want to show who was the author of the post, even if it's going to be changed. Other than that, it's pretty much the same as the add new post form. So that covers everything. There's quite a bit of code there though. So if I went too fast, make sure you download that source code. Now at the top of the file, we imported update post from the post slice, but we haven't created that yet. So let's jump back to the post slice and let's add that update CRUD operation. So we'll scroll up to where we've created these other async thunks that are above the slice. We've got fetch posts and add new post already. So we'll see what variation there is, as this is slightly different than add new post when we update a post. I've pasted in the new async thunk for update post, and we can see it's posts update post is the label. And then what we're sending in, once again, Control B so it doesn't scroll off the screen, we're sending in that initial post data, which is what that is. And we're destructuring and getting the ID from that initial post because we need the ID in the URL as we send this update to the API. And we're now using the HTTP method put with Axios. The rest of this is structured very similar to what you saw before up here. And of course, we're sending along that post data because we're now putting the data to update the existing post that has whatever ID that we pass into this URL. And as we previously learned in the last lesson about async thunks, they're handled with extra reducers where it receives a builder object and that builder responds to different cases. So here we have the add case for fetch posts, and it listens to pending, fulfilled, and rejected as far as the promise state, and then the add new post listen to fulfilled, and that's what we're going to do again with the update. So just underneath the previous case for add new post, here we're going to paste in our new case, and of course when I save we'll get some better formatting here as well. So saving, of course, adjusted that for us. Now let's look at this update post because it's slightly different. We're getting some information back here with the action payload, but we could have a successful post, essentially a post that is not rejected as a promise, but it might not have the status to 100. It might not have completed the update. Say the server sends a status code of 500, an error. And we'll discuss why this could happen, especially with our fake API in a moment, but let's first just consider the facts. So if the payload does not have the ID property, and we're checking that with optional chaining here, the question mark and the dot, then we're just going to log that the update could not complete, because what's really going to return is the error message from the catch block of Axios. So that action payload here, but it would still not be considered an error. It would be considered fulfilled because Axios still returned that information. So what happens is we get our error message right here, and then we just return to end this. But if everything goes as planned, we can destructure the ID from the action payload. We can set a new date on the action payload, and then we can go ahead and filter out the previous post with the same ID, and then we can update our state with all the previous posts, and then of course pass in the new post. So let's go back to our edit post form and make sure we applied everything from update post correctly. We already had the import here. Now let's look and make sure we're dispatching it correctly as well. So when we have the dispatch, it's right here, and we're calling our async thunk update post, and we're passing in all of the information that we need right here. Again, the only property that is not being passed in is the date, because we create a new one. With that confirmed, let's go back to our file tree and go back to our app.js so we can pull in our edit form and apply the proper routing as well. So after our single post page, we can say import edit post form, and their Visual Studio Code helps us out. It's from features, posts, and then our edit post form component. And then this will once again be a child of our post route. And so after we have our single post page here, we can paste this in and look at the route for editing a post. So now we would go to post/edit and then the post ID, and then we'll see our edit post form. Now let's drag Visual Studio Code to the left, and I'll go ahead and drag our blog so it fills up the entire screen. It looks a little better this way. We can go ahead and add a few votes for coffee on the first post and make sure they carry over to the view post page, and they do. Our state still stays updated and represents exactly what it should be. Now if we click edit post, we see the edit post form, and here we've pulled in the post title and content. So we should see if we could go ahead and update this. Let's select all of the title and just say shorter title right here. And we'll leave the author as Leanne Graham. And now inside the content area, I'll select all of that and just say, hey there. And we'll go down to our post, press enter, and now we see the new post. So we're at the post page, not the edit post page. It has a shorter title, still has 7 votes for coffee, and the update async thunk worked as expected. Now let's go back to the home page, and we see the full list of posts. And once again, we see our new title and new content in the first post, and we're on the home page. Let's go back to VS Code. I'll drag the app to the right. Let VS Code fill the screen, and we need to go back to the post slice because now we want to go ahead and create an async thunk that will allow us to delete a post as well. So now in the post slice, Control B to hide that file tree, and instead of way down by the builders, let's go up where we've created our async thunks. And right after update post, I will press enter a couple of times to allow some room and paste in our delete post, which is also very similar, but let's look at the differences. So here we've labeled it post/delete post. We're still receiving initial post data. We're still destructuring and getting that ID from that initial post data. And now we're going to go to axios.delete, so the HTTP method delete, and the URL looks just like it did for our update post. It needs the ID to know which post to delete. Now we see some things here that are almost unique to our fake REST API that we're using from JSON placeholder, because even though we send the delete request, JSON placeholder doesn't send back the ID. Typically, a REST API would send back the ID of the post you just deleted, at least in my experience. But JSON placeholder doesn't do that. If anything, we just get an empty object. So what we're doing here is checking to see if the response status is 200. And if so, then we're just returning that same initial post data so we can grab the ID out of it inside of our builder case as we move down here in the post slice. But if it does not have a status of 200, then we're returning a message that has whatever status and status text there is, so that could at least be logged if we did not get the correct information that we expected that says our post is deleted, and this is essentially passing that ID along. So now let's add our builder case to handle this delete post async thunk. So as we scroll down to the bottom of our add case list, I'll paste in this case and save. It looks like it's already formatted well. So we're looking for fulfilled again on the delete post. And here, this is much like what we had in the create post. So we're making sure we have that ID property here with optional chaining. We're checking for that on the payload. And if it does not exist for any reason, we're then saying the delete could not be completed, or it says delete could not complete, and we log whatever the action payload is, which could be that error message. It's whatever that status and status text would be. And then otherwise, we're destructuring, getting the ID, and then we're filtering out all of the other posts that are not equal to that ID. And then we're just setting the state to those posts because we've essentially deleted that post. And so we don't want it in the state any longer. And now let's go to the edit post form and allow a post to be deleted as well. Essentially, let's put that async thunk we just created into action. So besides the select post, by ID, and update post from the post slice, we also need to import delete post. And now when we scroll down, we already have our on save post clicked. So this one will be very similar. We'll just come down here after the user's options and we'll put in on delete post clicked. And we can see we still set the status to pending, not depending. And then we have dispatch, and we're dispatching our delete post. All we need to pass in is the ID because that's all that's needed to send to the API to delete the post. And of course, it's all that's needed to remove it from our state as well. We still use unwrap here, so we can use try catch logic. We still use navigate, but now after we delete a post, we just want to navigate back to the home page. So we just navigate to the slash. And then as far as the rest of this goes, we just set the request status back to idle as we do with the on save post clicked, and we just log the error the same as we do with the on save post clicked as well. But now to call the delete into action, we need to add a separate button for that. So after our save post button, we'll just put the delete right here underneath, paste that in, and you can see it's just calling that on delete post clicked, and we'll save. A very small thing that I just noticed, no big deal, but this was using backticks. So at some point it was a template literal and I just changed it. It doesn't need to have backticks when I'm not passing anything in. So I'll just use single quotes there instead of the backticks and save in our navigate. And while we're at it, considering this navigate, let's go to our file tree, go to the add post form, and allow some navigation as well after we add that new post. So we're going to import use navigate from React Router DOM. And after we have that, we need to apply, well, we need to first define our navigate from use navigate. So let's paste that in as well here, but I'll save, keep that on a separate line. So now we can define navigate and use it after our post is saved. And once again, after we create a new post, we just want to go back to the home page. So here, after we set all of the local state for the form, we'll just navigate back to the home page. So now we can try more of this out. Let's drag Visual Studio Code to the left, drag the app to full screen, and test everything out. We're here on the home page. Of course, it reloaded, and when it reloaded, we lost our state there, but we've got, say, 4 thumbs up, 9 coffees. We can view the post. It goes ahead and keeps those reactions. We can edit the post again, and we'll say small title, and then inside of here, we'll just say, hey. And now we have our new post, essentially our edited post that has a small title and says, hey, all of that looks good. We go back to the home page. That's good too. So now let's go to the post page. Let's add a new post and we can say, hey there, and give another author. And then we'll say small post number 2. And then save, and now we've got a second post as well, so we can create. Notice after we saved that new post, we navigated right back to the home page. Now let's delete a post. So when we go to view post, then we can go to edit post, and if I scroll down, yep, we've got a delete post button now. So this is post from Leanne Graham that had small title and hey. If we delete the post, we have navigated back to the home page, and you can see her post was not this one. It said a small title, I believe. So it is gone, but we still have our hey there post. Now, here's something about new posts and working with the fake API. We really can't update them because it doesn't exist on the fake API. So this would be like post 101 instead of the 100 posts from that API. So if we go to the edit and we want to say small post number 23 and then put U after this, and then we save, it doesn't go ahead and update. Notice we don't have those changes. And that's because we got that message back from the API where it really wasn't a successful update. So let's quickly look at that, and I'll show you a change you can make to make sure that your state is working fine as you want it to, and ignore that response from the API. But you wouldn't want to leave it this way normally. So let's look at the post slice, and we'll go to the update async thunk that we created. There is our update post. And instead of returning the error message here, which is what is happening, and then we're just exiting out of our builder case, what happens is we could return the initial post that once again has that same data that we were updating with. And that's what we expect the API to send back when it is successful. Of course, it sends a 500, a server status 500, because it cannot update a post that doesn't exist at the API. We can interact with this fake API, but we can't really create the post there. So if we save this change, and I guess we should note only for testing Redux, and save. So if we change this, then we should go ahead and get our state updated correctly. I'll move this back to the left, and yeah, we've got post not found because we made some updates and changes now. So let's go back to home. Let's create a new post. So this would be post ID 101. We'll say hey, and pretty much say the same thing here. Save post. There's our new post. Now we can view it. And after we view it, let's go to edit post and save post. Hey there. Let's see if we can go ahead and update this with you and save. And now we've got hey there you. So it did update as we wanted it to. It does look like just like the end of the last lesson, there's somewhere that I have named the emojis incorrectly because we're not getting numbers next to all of those. Let's see if we can find that by pulling this back to the right and looking at Visual Studio Code. And in the post slice, I bet we have somewhere named those incorrectly, because it should be start with a thumbs up and end with a coffee every time. Let's make sure we're getting those accurate. And here is the problem. Our add new post fulfilled was not updated, at least in this code. So I'll save that, and that could have actually been in the source code from the starter code as well. So you want to make sure you have all of those named accurately, and then the names or at least the emojis and the numbers should show up correctly. I'll drag this back to the left. Once again, not found, but let's create a new post and make sure that goes ahead and updates as we wanted to. Hey there, and yes, we've got everything accurate there. Save. I'll say again, and updated. Yes, we still have all the numbers by the emojis, so that looks good as well. Now, it's currently worth noting that if we go to the View Post page and then we refresh, even though we're loading in data from the API, we get post not found. But we can go ahead and correct this behavior. So let's pull this to the right and go back to Visual Studio Code. And for Visual Studio Code, we're going to go to the index.js. And if you remember from a previous tutorial, we are loading the users immediately at the app load. Well, really, that's all we need to do as far as getting the posts from the API as well. So let's go ahead and import our fetch posts from the post slice as well, and then we can dispatch that fetch posts as just like we are fetch users. So we'll have posts there, and now we just need to make some changes in our post list. So in the file tree, I'll scroll to post lists, and here at the top, now we're not going to need some of the things that we were using. One of those things is use effect, so we can remove that. Another is the import of fetch posts, because we'll no longer be using it here. And finally, use dispatch, because we will no longer be dispatching fetch posts as well. So I could remove this empty line here. And now inside of our code, we can remove the definition of dispatch, and we can remove use effect where fetch post is called. And after I do that, I'll go ahead and save. Okay, once again, dragging Visual Studio Code to the left and expanding the blog that we have. And now when we load the page, just like when I hit reload, we instantly have the posts. Now when I go to view post and I hit reload, we still have the post. So again, feel free to download the CSS that I have from the source code and tweak it and maybe fix a little thing or two that I have overlooked possibly. Otherwise, everything is very complete and we have all CRUD operations now inside of the post slice for our different blog posts. So if we scroll up and look at our async thunks, we have fetch posts, add new post, update post, and delete post. I've got our React Redux blog project open here on the left, and on the right I've got DevTools open, and it's the React DevTools. I used the profiler to record our application every time I clicked the thumbs up emoji for the first post. And as you can see from the 3 screens that I have, every time I click that emoji, I re-rendered all 100 posts, even though the emoji is just for the first post. Today we'll fix that and apply some other optimizations to our application. Okay, I've got Visual Studio Code open here, and we're at the edit post form of the starter code. Now you can download this starter code from the link in the description below, or if you've been working through this series with me, maybe you've already got it. And that's what I want to address before we get started with anything else. One thing from the previous tutorial in this series in the edit post form.js, and that is on the on author changed. I don't believe in the previous tutorial I wrapped this value in number, and it needs to be a number, otherwise it saves a string and then the comparison doesn't work and you don't get the updated author. Now again, this was already changed in the repository for the starting code, so if you've just downloaded that, you've already got this here. Now before I apply optimizations today, I want to add a couple of quick features that will help me demonstrate these optimizations. The first one is going to be in the users folder, and we're going to create a users list. So I'll start a new file and name this users with a capital U and then list with a capital L.js. Nothing really new in the file, so I'll just paste in the ingredients and we'll quickly cover this. Now I'll get rid of that extra line at the top, but we're importing use selector as we have before, and our select all users selector, and then link from React Router DOM. And then inside the component, we are getting the users by calling the use selector here and passing in the select all users selector that we created in the user slice. And then we render the users. So inside of rendered users is an array full of these list items because we're calling map over all of the users. And then each user gets their own link. And then, of course, it links to an individual page for each user based on that user ID. And then you can see we just return the rendered users here at the end of the component. And so that's essentially the entire users list component. Now we need to create the user page for each user. But before we do that, we need to go to the user slice and create a select user by ID selector. So let's scroll down. And once we get down to the bottom here, just under select all users, we'll add some space. I'll paste this in just to go a little faster, but it's really easy to create. We call it select user by ID, gets the state and the user ID, and then we just call the user state here, state.users, and then find on that, and we return what matches the user.id to the user ID that we pass in. And of course we have export here, so it's ready to go and we'll be able to import it into the user page that we create. So now let's create this new component and we'll call it user, not users, but just user singular page with a capital P.js. This component doesn't have much new either, so I'll paste this in. Now, of course, it's going to be able to display any given user that has their data passed in. So at the top, we have use selector, and then we're importing that select user by ID that we just created in the user slice. We're also importing select all posts. And then from React Router, we're importing link and the use params hook. So we're going to get that user ID out of the URL. And that's what we're doing right here is we call use params. We're grabbing that user ID. Now note that will be a string as it comes from the URL. So we need to wrap it in number once again when we pass it into a selector. And that's what we're doing here to get the user. we're calling useSelector, and of course inside that it receives the state, and then we use that selector we created, select user by ID, which receives the state and the user ID that must be wrapped as a number. And then we have posts for the user, because what we want to do is not only get the user, we want to display a list of all of their posts. So once again, we use useSelector, we pass in the state, and then we use select all posts inside of the useSelector to define all posts. And then we call filter on all posts and return the result where the post.userID matches the user ID. So we get all of the posts that belong to any given user, and then we list those out, and now we link the titles of those posts to a specific post ID page, which we've already created in a previous tutorial. So we can go to a specific post for any given post. They have their own page already. And then, of course, down here, we're just displaying the name and an H2 and all of those post titles with their links. And that is the end of the user page component. All right, with those components created and this selector created in the user slice, we're ready to go to the app.js. Now, just under the import of the edit post form, we're going to import user list, and we're going to import user page. After that, we need to scroll down, and this will look a lot like the path to the post information here, where we have route path equals post, but this will be for user, and I'll paste this in, I'll save to get some better formatting. And we can see we've got our path user, then there's an index route, and it's going to display the user list component. And then if the route has an ID, a user ID at the end of it, then it's going to display the user page component. And while we're in the app.js, let's scroll up. I need to import navigate from React Router DOM, and we're going to add a catch-all page. Now you could create a 404 and display it, but what I'm going to do is just put essentially a redirect here with navigate, and we'll navigate back to the home page if any page doesn't exist. But as I note here in a comment, you could replace with a 404 if you want to. And this is a catch-all. It's got the asterisk here, which is going to select any route that makes it past these other routes. So if it doesn't match any of these, then it will be grabbed here, and then it's just going to redirect to the home page with navigate. Notice I've got the replace flag here also, and that's going to replace the bad request, whatever that address or page was that didn't exist. It's going to replace that in history with the good address that we're sending the user to. Now we're almost finished with this and ready to test it out, but first let's go to the components directory, go to the header, and here after the post link, I'm going to press Shift Alt and the down arrow to copy that line down, and then we'll just change this to user. But then here, instead of post, I'm going to say users, because it's actually going to display a users list. So I'll save that change as well. And now we're ready to test it out. So I'm going to press Control and the backtick, type npm start to start up our app, and then drag Visual Studio Code to the left, click on Chrome so we can see what comes up, and we'll see if we have any errors or if everything is working as expected. And here's our blog. It appears everything is working as expected. We see users up here in the top right, so I will click on that. And now we have our users page, and we have our list of users. So I'll just click on the first user. And now we have Leanne Graham from the data that we're getting from JSON placeholder, which is the data source for this blog that we're making an example of. And then we have 10 posts, and of course this is lorem ipsum text here, but these different 10 titles of posts, and we can click one and go to any specific post as well. So it all worked out like we expected it to. And let's click and go back to users, and everything looks pretty good here. Now we need to add one more feature before we can apply these optimizations that I would like to. So I'm going to grab Chrome, drag it to the right, grab Visual Studio Code, let it fill out the page, close the terminal, and head over to the posts slice. And inside the post slice, we're going to add a simple counter. Now it really has no purpose in the blog, but it's going to be a nice review for implementing some new state with Redux, and it's also going to help me demonstrate some optimizations. So to do that, we're going to start out here in our initial state, and I'll put a comma, and then I'll just put a count value of 0 to go along with the rest of the initial state. Next, we're going to scroll down past all of our async thunks, and get down to the create slice where we have our reducers. Now, we're not using post added anymore ever since we applied our async thunks. So I can really eliminate that. And if we come down here all the way, I'll just select it all and hit backspace. So we still have our reaction added. Now underneath reaction added, I'm going to go ahead and put in the other reducer that we have here. And that is going to be increase count. It's very basic. It accepts state and action just like reaction added does. But then we're just taking state count and we're adding 1 to it. Now again, you can write code that looks like it mutates the data inside of create slice. We can only do this inside of create slice. And so that's what we're doing here, just kind of like you see here with the reactions as well. So you might see code that looks like it would mutate the data, but Immer.js is running underneath the hood only inside of the create slice, and that's why we can do it here. And now we need to create another selector for our count. So we'll scroll all the way down here to our selectors. I'll click on the last one in that grouping where get post error is, and we'll just change this then to get count. And then it's going to be state.posts.count. Now, action creator functions are automatically created when we put a reducer in the create slice portion of the slice. So we removed that post added, and so now we can add what we created, which is called increase count. So we need to export that action creator function. Now we can save our changes here in the slice, and what we're going to do is go to the header component where we were just a little bit ago to add this users link, and we're going to apply the counter to this component. So underneath our import of link, I'm just pasting in the other imports, but we have use dispatch and use selector from React Redux. And then we have increase count and get count from the post slice. So then we need to define our dispatch here. So we'll say const dispatch equals use dispatch. And after that, we also need to get our count. So there we're going to use the selector we imported, and we'll use get count that we created. And finally, in the nav, after the unordered list, I'm just going to paste in a button. When I save, it formats better. But this button has an on click, and that's where we dispatch the increase count function. And then we have the count state on the button. So that's all there is to it, really. Let's drag Visual Studio Code back to the left, and let's see what error we have. It says get count is not found inside of the post slice. So let's see what's going on with that. I'll need the full screen to figure that out. Let's look at the post slice, and let's see if we have get count. Oh, I spelled it wrong. I had an R at the end. Once I remove that R and save, we should be good to go. Okay, let's drag this back to the left. It looks like it's working now. And now everything seems to be working. Here's our button in the very top right, and if I click it, we should see it increment. Yep, went right up to 5 after 5 clicks. And now we're ready to make our first optimization. And what you need here, at least to record and see that you need to make optimizations, is React DevTools. Now I'm going to open up DevTools by right-clicking and choosing Inspect. You could also press Control, Shift, and the letter I. But once you're in DevTools, then you want to select the couple of greater than signs here that allow you to see more tabs, essentially. And once you have React DevTools, which I'll link to in the description, so if you don't have those, you can get it for free at the Chrome Web Store, and it's an extension you install for Chrome, and I believe it's available for other browsers as well. We're going to choose the profiler here, and once we have the profiler, it wants us to start a recording. Well, I'm going to go to the page for Leanne Graham over here on the left, so now we're at an individual user page, and then I'm going to start recording our app, and I'm going to go ahead and click the button 5 more times. After I've done that, I'm going to stop recording, and now we can see the components here, and we have 5 pages to arrow through. And we're seeing what rendered. So we can see this orange indicates the header rendered, and that's correct because the state changed. But notice what else happened. The user page also rendered, and that's kind of strange because the user page isn't related to the count at all. The count's in the header, and that state really has nothing to do with the user page other than they're both kept in the post slice. So if we arrow through our pages here, we'll see that the user page is rendering every time that the header was updated, and we still see that. And so that's kind of strange and really not what we want. So why is that happening? Let's go back and take a look at our code once again. I'll drag this over so it takes up the full page, but we need to look at the code of the user page component. So here inside of the user page component, I'm going to scroll up until we see the posts for user definition. And here we're using the use selector. We pass in the state, then we select all posts with the select all posts selector, and then we're returning all posts, but it's filtered. And this is where we run into a problem. There's really nothing wrong with filter. It just returns a new array every time. And use selector will run every time an action is dispatched. And so when we dispatch that increase count in the header, then the use selector runs again, and it forces a component to re-render if a new reference value is returned. We're returning a new value every time with filter, so that's why we're rendering the user page. And we can fix all of this by creating a memoized selector. So let's go back to the post slice and learn how to do this. So back here in the post slice, I'll find it in the list over here on the left. I want to scroll to the top first, and let's look at our imports here. We have create slice, nano ID that we're no longer using, so we can remove that. We have create async thunk, and after that I'm going to import create selector, and we'll use that to create this memoized selector. So let's scroll down now to our selectors all the way towards the bottom, and we'll find here we have select post by ID. This is going to be just a little bit different. This is going to be select post by user. So when I save, I think I'll get the formatting I want. Yes, so here we have select posts by user, and we're using our create selector. Create selector accepts one or more input functions, and notice they're inside of brackets like an array. That should be your first clue that these are dependencies. Actually, the values returned from these functions are the dependencies, and they provide the input parameters for the output function of our memoized selector. So if the select all post value changes, or this anonymous function, which is taking state and user ID, and it's simply returning the user ID, we just need the user ID, so we have to write a simple function to do that because these are input functions. But then if posts or the user ID changes, essentially, that's the only time that we'll get something new from this selector. That's the only time that it will rerun, so it's memoized. So with this added now to our slice, let's go back to our user page and use this memoized selector. So let's find the user page. There it is. Now at the top, we've already got select user by ID. This is going to be coming from the post slice as well, and this is select posts by user. So I'll just put it after our select all posts. And now that we've imported it, let's use it inside of the file. So we'll come down here where we were previously calling filter and creating that new value, and we'll just replace everything that we had for the post for user, and now we'll use our new selector that we've created. I'm going to press Control B so we can see everything, but here we're using use selector once again, passing in the state, but now we're using this new memoized selector we created, select posts by user ID. It gets the state. Once again, we're making sure it's a number because we're getting that from use params, where it's a string from the URL, and then we're passing that user ID in. So now that we've made these changes, let's go ahead and drag Visual Studio Code to the left. Let's go back, let's clear out the changes here, and let's see if we need to reload or make any other changes if we're getting everything we expect. We are not getting our posts currently. Let's go back and quickly check our code. There may be something wrong with that selector we created, so I'll double check that. That's back in the post slice. As I'm looking through this, yes, there is a problem. We've got post.user. I should have put post.user ID, and that's what we need to check. So once I make that change, we go back, and now we'll of course make the Chrome browser, fill up the page, and yes, now we've got all the posts here on the individual user page. So we're once again ready to check. So what I'm going to do is start recording again with React Dev Tools, clicking the number button 5 times and stopping. Notice what happened now. As we look on our first page even, we can see that we've got it right. We're rendering the header. We're not rendering the user page anymore. So on each of these attempts, we did not re-render the user page. And that's why I wanted to add a counter, just to give something that was completely not a reference to what we had in the other component, and really out of the way as well, to just show how one can impact the other if you do not apply the optimization correctly. So now that we have this memo-wise selector, we're not re-rendering the user page every time we increase the count. Okay, with this problem solved, I'm going to clear out the profiler again. Let's go back to the home page, and while we're here, I'll start recording a profile again. I'm just going to click thumbs up about 3 times again and stop the profile. And let's see what we're getting. So every time I clicked the thumbs up, we got not only the post list, but every individual post excerpt was also rendered. So we've got 100 of those. So 1 thumbs up meant re-rendering all of these. And as I arrow through, you'll see they re-rendered every time we added a reaction. So we do need to fix that as well. And there's a couple of ways to do it. I'm going to drag Chrome back over to the right, and DevTools will fill up the screen. Not DevTools, VS Code will fill up the screen again. And now there is one quick way to do this that is definitely legitimate, and there's nothing wrong with doing it this way. However, we're going to look at a full-featured solution after this also. So what we're going to do first is just say import React from React. We don't usually have to do that, but in this case we will. We're going to change this const for post excerpt to a let, and you'll quickly see why here, because after that we're going to set post, is it post or posts? It's posts with a plural s at the end, excerpt, and we'll set that equal to react.memo, and then we'll pass in posts excerpt. And what that does really is it allows this component to not re-render if the prop that it receives has not changed. So if the post does not change, that's passed to post excerpt, it will not re-render. So this easily solves the immediate problem that we have. So I'll just save that one change right there, and now I'll drag this back over. We'll go ahead and look at Chrome in the full screen again. I'll clear out our previous recording, and we'll go back home and we'll start a recording, and I'll click 3 more thumbs up, and now we'll stop the recording. And now look at our profile recording. We've got the post list, which is fine, and that's expected, but we're only rendering this first post excerpt, and of course anything that's nested in it. Here's the time ago component, which that's so small it doesn't really hurt a thing anyway. But overall, for this example, we just wanted that one post excerpt to render, and that's what happened. Let's look at the next page, same result, and the next page, same result. So now we eliminated that big list. Okay, there's nothing wrong with our React.memo solution, but I'm going to remove all of this, and I'll show you why, because we're going to talk about state normalization and just using normalized data overall, which is recommended. And then after this, I've got this last line to remove here. After this, we'll quickly discuss all of the benefits. Okay, normalized state structure is a recommended approach for storing items. And normalization means no duplication of data, and it also means keeping the items stored in a lookup table by item ID. So our normalized state shape is comprised of an object with an IDs array, and then a nested entities object that contains all of the items. And the best part of using normalized data with Redux Toolkit is that Redux Toolkit offers a Create Entity Adapter API, and that will make your slices less complicated and easier to manage. Let's get started with normalized state back in the post slice file. So we'll have to go back up to where the imports are, And you can see I'm getting kind of a long line here. I'll press Control B again for all the imports from Redux.js Toolkit. And so instead of that, I'll just paste in the difference where I put them on each line. You can see we've got the three we were already using, but then I'm also adding the create entity adapter. Okay, next under our post URL, I'm going to paste this in, but it's a posts adapter that we're going to create. And here we have the create entity adapter, and we can put a sort comparer function inside of the create entity adapter. Now this should look familiar because it's kind of like what we are using inside of the post list. So if I open the file tree quickly, look at the post list, we were previously applying a sort that looked much like that right here inside the component. So one thing I like about this already is we're abstracting this back to the slice instead of doing that logic in the component. So now let's go back to the slice again, and you can see that here where it does the sorting. Let's scroll just a little bit, and now instead of just our initial state, and I'm going to select down here through post as well, we're going to have the post adapter.get initial state for the initial state. And notice I got rid of the empty array that was posts because our initial state will already, even if we didn't put anything else in it, it will already return that normalized object that I was talking about, where you have an array of the item IDs, and then you have that entities object that will actually have all the items. So that's there automatically, and this is the extra state we're adding on top of that. And now we may need to change some of our reducers and other functions. The async thunks are just fine, so let's scroll down and let's look at how we get the existing posts for our reaction added. Here we're using state.post.find, and we'll be able to change that. So now it's going to be state.entities, and we're passing in that post ID because we're using this as an object lookup. So the entities is an object, and then we're passing in the ID to look up that specific post. And now as we scroll down here into the builder cases, there are several to look at, and we're going to specifically be looking at the fulfilled cases. So when we get down here, instead of the state.post equaling state.post.concat and the loaded posts, we're going to change this now because this post adapter has its own CRUD methods. So let's look at the first one, which is upsert many, and we just pass in the state and then the loaded posts. Now let's scroll down to the add new post where we have the fulfilled here, and once again, instead of state.post.push, I'll select that, and this has its own method as well. So it's postadapter.add1, and we pass in the state and the action payload, which is the new post. Now we're looking at updatePost.fulfilled, and as we get down here, instead of setting the state.posts equal to this new array where we spread in the posts and the action payload, we can use postadapter.upsert1, pass in the state and the action payload once again. And finally, for the delete post fulfilled, instead of state.post equals posts, we'll just highlight that part and we postadapter.remove1, pass in the state and the ID. So now you've noticed, of course, there's a line or two that we're not using. We're not using this posts line right here. And actually, if you didn't want to destructure the ID, you could say action.payload.id here and just have it right there instead of that line. But I kind of like just having it down to the ID myself. Also here in the update, we no longer need to define posts as well because we are just getting it from the action payload there as well. And here, we're not using this ID we destructured at all either, so we can remove that. I believe the rest is fine. Let me double check as I scroll up. Everything else, yep, looks good. So with that, we now need to scroll down to the selectors area. I'm going to save the changes we've made so far, and we'll be replacing some of these selectors because getSelectors is another method we're going to call that automatically creates some selectors that we would typically need. One of those would be the select all posts. So we can remove this, And the other one would be select post by ID. So we can remove that as well. And then it's going to give us one new selector. I'll paste this in and we'll take a look. So here again, get selectors creates these selectors. Then we're using ES6 destructuring to give them aliases so they match up with our pre-existing code. So get selectors creates select all, select by ID, and then select IDs. We're going to, of course, name them select all posts that we already had, select post by ID that we already had, and then just to stick with that naming convention here, we'll say select post IDs. Notice we do need to pass in a simple state selector here, and we can do that with an anonymous function. So you do have to pass in a selector that returns the post slice of state right there. So post adapter dot get selectors, pass in a selector for the state, but then it creates these three that we can export with these aliases that we are assigning using destructuring. I'll save, and I want to say we're finished, but VS Code is telling me there's an error up there, so I really want to check and see what I did that might have created a problem. And now I see the issue, export's underlined here because we have our get initial state, and then I just had a curly brace at the end, so if we put a parentheses around that, should be good. Now that's quite a few changes to the post slice to put this create entity adapter into action. However, once you get the hang of applying this post adapter, it sure made things a lot easier, especially down here where we applied the CRUD methods. It also made it very easy to get the existing post here for reaction added as we got it from the entities object lookup. But then all of these different CRUD methods from upsert many, and then we had add one, and then upsert one, and eventually remove one. All of those make that pretty easy to work with. Now there are more methods, and I'll make sure to link to those in the description, or at least the documentation for those in the description. And now we need to make a couple of changes in the post list component to take advantage of the changes we just made in the post slice. So right up here at the top with the imports, now instead of select all posts, we're going to select the post IDs. So now we have select post IDs, and now we're going to change this post that we have with use selector all posts, which we're no longer importing, and we're going to define our ordered post IDs right here using the use selector and pass in the select post IDs. And then in the succeeded block here of our conditional with the if and loading status and then succeeded and then finally failed, we'll change what we have here because remember we're doing that sort compare function already inside the create entity adapter that's inside the post slice. We no longer need to sort here, and we'll set the content just a little bit differently because we're using the ordered post IDs. We'll map over that and we'll pass in post ID. So let's save these changes and now go to our post excerpt that we did have the React memo on, but we'll just make a few changes here as well. So now it's not just getting the post, it's getting the post ID. And we also need to go ahead and import a couple of things. So let's put the imports here. We'll have the use selector and the select post by ID selector that we've created. And then inside the component, we'll put those to work by calling, well, we'll have use selector here, and then we'll call the select post by ID when we pass in the state and the post ID that we received as a prop. After that, we'll have our post defined, and everything in the JSX should work as it was before. Okay, that's a lot of changes, but let's drag VS Code back to the left and let's look at our page. I'll clear out the profiler altogether for now, and let's just make sure everything's working first. So let's view a post. We've got a post here, we can edit the post, all of that looks good. And of course, here on the home page, we see all of the post excerpts as we expect. So now let's see what happens when we record the profile and we click on thumbs up 3 times. And now we'll stop the recording. Once again, it only rendered that very first post excerpt. So everything is working as expected with the normalized data. We simplified the post slice and we were able to use those adapter CRUD methods, and then it also created some selectors for us that we destructured and, of course, using aliases renamed what we already had in our code. But we simplified our code, we pulled more logic out of the components, put it in the post slice, and now this optimization, stood the test of time here as far as rendering all of our post excerpts and only re-rendering the one that got the reaction. So those are some good optimizations to add into your Redux Toolkit arsenal. I'm providing a beginner's example of RTK Query. We'll build a simple React CRUD app with RTK Query, and I think you will see it is very easy to use. I'm going to move at a slightly faster pace today since I don't expect you to be a React beginner. Being a beginner with RTK Query is totally expected, and that's what we're going to work through. Okay, let's look at the package JSON first, and you can see the dependencies I've got here. The first three are for Font Awesome, and I'm using Font Awesome to create some icons that are actually rendered as components, and you'll see that in the code. If you haven't done that before, I'll leave a link to how to do that in the description. Very easy, but you need these three dependencies, and so while we're not covering that today, that's part of it. Then of course we've already got Redux.js/toolkit, that dependency here as well. The one to really note today is React has upgraded to version 18 now. So that does make a change from what you may be used to seeing in the index file. We won't really use any of those features today so much, but we're using the new version. So before we might have had React DOM.render. And notice React DOM is now being imported from React DOM/client instead of just React DOM. If you don't do that, you'll get a warning. And then we're using create root here and putting the document get element by ID root right here. And then we're just chaining the .render on after that. So some very small changes just due to React version 18 that you see in the index.js, but not covering React 18 today. And really it won't impact anything else we're doing. Now also in the starter code here that's available for download from the link in the description is a data folder. And notice I've got a db.json, and it just has all of these to-dos in it. And that's because we're going to use JSON Server. So to install that, if you don't already have JSON Server installed, now I'm already running the React app here, by the way. So we're going to just open a second terminal window. Now to install JSON Server, if you don't have it, we're going to install it globally. Type JSON Server, and then you would want, well, actually to install it, you'd type npm I JSON Server, and then -g. That's the global install. Now I've already got it installed, so I'm not going to press enter right now, but that's how you would install it if you need it. After that, to go ahead and start the server, you type JSON-server, and then you'll have --watch, and then you need to specify where your data is. Well, it's in our data folder, and then it's db.json. And then we're going to specify a port, which is port 3500, and then press enter. It will identify our to-dos there, and it starts watching that data. So now it will support create, read, update, and delete functions. Okay, now that I've got that running, and like I said, I have the app running over here in the other terminal window, I'm just going to close the terminal window for now and close this db.json. And let's take a quick look at the app.js. And you can see here we're importing a to-do list component that is in a features directory, and then a to-dos directory, and then there's our to-do list component. And this is how you typically organize features when you're using Redux. So that's the reason for that file structure if you're not familiar with Redux. Okay, and then we're just returning that to-do list component here in the app component. So really nothing else going on. So let's break this out and look at that to-do list component. Now what we don't have here is any integration with RTK Query yet, but other than that, you may have created a to-do list before. If not, we'll have the basic code together for one today. But we're still going to add some imports here for RTK Query. We're going to handle a submit and handle adding a new to-do. And then as we scroll on down here, you can see the form we have, and that's for adding that new to-do. And of course, we're using state here. So we have new to-do and set new to-do. Other than that, we're going to create some content based on conditionals, conditional content, and then we'll render that content here in the JSX. So that's all the starter code. Now let's get started by integrating RTK Query into our project. We'll start by adding an API directory inside of the features directory. So I'll click the new folder up there and we'll name this API, which is also the default. If we were to name this something else, we would have to specify that for RTK query. So I'll leave it as the default today, which also makes sense. It's the representing the API in our code. Now let's add a file to this API directory. It'll be called API slice with camel case, a capital S, and then .js. Okay, inside the API slice, this is where we will create our methods to interact with the API. It essentially replaces something like Axios and pulls that code out of our component logic and over here in a separate API slice, which is kind of how we name things in Redux if you're familiar with Redux and if you've gone through my Redux Toolkit series. Okay, I'm going to paste in the imports. And you can see we've got create API and fetch base query being imported from Redux.js, Toolkit query, React. And so yes, this is specific to React. You can use Redux Toolkit and RTK query without using React. But this, of course, this imports some tools specifically for React. And now I'm going to paste in the slice, and you can see it's export, so we can export the slice, export const API slice, and then we use create API. Inside of this, it's an object, as you can see with the curly braces. The first thing we do is define the reducer path. Again, this is the default, so if we didn't put this here, it would still be okay because it would just default to that. But I'm going ahead and including it, and again, you would need to rename that if that is not what you were calling it. Now then we have a base query, and this uses the fetch base query that we imported. And then there's a base URL. This should look very familiar to you if you're familiar with Axios, because you can define a base URL with Axios as well. Today we're using JSON server with our local dev environment, so it is just our local host and then port 3500 as we specified for JSON server. From there, we're defining endpoints for the API to interact with. And if you did work through my Redux Toolkit series, then you are familiar with the builder cases that we had in Redux Toolkit. And this is very similar. So we once again pass in a builder, and then we're defining methods to interact with the API. So we're going to get all of the to-dos. So I'm just naming this get to-dos. And we have builder.query. And then inside of that, we have our query method. And it once again is just an anonymous function that passes the /to-dos that would be attached to the base URL. It's going to request then all of the to-dos with an HTTP GET method. And then one very cool feature about RTK query is it creates custom hooks based on the methods that we provide. So we could name this something else like get pizzas or something like that, and it would create these custom hooks based on that name. So this says use get to-dos query, but if we named this get pizzas, it would be use get pizzas query. So it's going to start with use and end with query, and it's going to use whatever name we use for the method in between. So down here we've just got export const, and we're destructuring, getting the use get to-dos query from API slice. And now before we put this custom hook to use inside of our to-do list component, I'll save this file, we need to go back to the index.js. Some might do this in the app.js, but it's just like the context provider. If you were using the context API with React, we need to provide our slice to the app. So there's a couple of imports we need to use here, and we're importing the API provider, once again from Redux.js, Toolkit, Query, and React. And then we're importing that API slice that we created and exported. So it's from features, API, and then we're getting the API slice. So once we have those, we need to wrap our app with that provider. And I'll do that just by highlighting the app and then pasting this over it so you can see, but we're absolutely wrapping this app component in the API provider, and then we're passing in the API to the API or with the API provider, and it is of course the API slice that we created. And now that our app can access this, we can put that hook to use that we created. So let's go to the to-do list component. At the very top where I noted add imports with a comma or a comment, I'm going to just paste in this import, and it is the use get to-dos query that we created right here. So then we need to define that or use it inside of the component. And we'll do that by just pasting this in, and let's look at everything we get from this hook, which is quite a bit. We're getting data, and we're destructuring all of this, and I'm renaming the data to-dos here. And then we have is loading, is success, is error, and finally, of course, if there is an error, we find out what that error is. So this looks a lot like a custom use Axios hook or some other logic you may have seen used in a component before. And once again, this custom hook is being created for us. So that's pretty awesome with RTK query. Now let's go ahead and use this to conditionally render some content. I'm going to scroll down, and where we find our content here, and I left a comment that said define conditional content, I'll just paste this in quickly and we'll break it down. We've got if is loading, so if that's true, we're just going to render this loading paragraph. And if you have a spinner component, that's a great place to put it as well. Else if is success, meaning we've received that data. For now, we're just going to use JSON stringify and have it render to the page. So it won't look pretty, but we'll know we've got it. And then the final else if here is error. And then if that is true, of course, we have an error, and we're going to display what that error is. And you can see in the JSX, we're just going to render that content. So let's save all of this. And now let's pull this over to the left, Visual Studio Code that is, and see what this looks like. Okay, we've got an error. It looks like an import is wrong where we've got /API slice. So let's see what's going on. I'll pull this back over so I can see the full thing, and we'll need to scroll up to the top. And yeah, that's probably not where that is. So let's find our API slice. We needed to go up out of the to-dos, 2 dots, not 2 slashes. And then we need to go into the API folder, then find the API slice. And we were missing that API folder there in the import. Okay, we should be good. I'll drag this back to the left. And yep, we're getting all of that JSON stringify data here on the page. So we are receiving all of the data. Okay, let's pull Visual Studio Code back over so we can view it in a full screen. And now that we know we're receiving the data, let's go back to that API slice and add our other methods. Okay, we'll put a comma right after this getToDos method, and we can paste in our next method here. And that would be an addToDo. And notice something different about it. Instead of a builder.query, it is a builder.mutation. And the rest of our methods will be mutations. And that means we're actually changing the data. We're not just requesting or querying the data. But then we'll still have the keyword query right here. And notice a to-do is being passed in because it needs a new to-do. And then we're once again specifying a URL, but this time we're saying it is the URL instead of just having a default query like we did above. We're also saying what method we're using because it could be different. It could be put or patch or delete, or like we have here is post. And then for the body of this request, we're just passing in that new to-do. Okay, after the add to-do, let's go ahead and paste in the update to-do, and look how it is very similar to the add to-do. It's also a builder mutation. It also receives a to-do. But notice the URL is different. Here we're using a template literal, so we can specify the specific to-do with its ID that we're going to update. And we're using patch and not put. You could use either one. Put is typically used as the method when you're replacing the full record, and patch is typically when you're just updating part of the record. So I'm using patch right here. We are passing in the to-do though. And then after that, let's go ahead and put in the delete. And to do that, I'm going to scroll a little bit so we can see it all. And here is our delete to-do. Once again, it's a mutation. Now we only need the ID, whereas the update needed not only the to-do ID, but also the to-do itself. Here we just need the ID, so we're destructuring that from the to-do as it's passed in, or whatever object we send with the ID. And then we're passing in that same URL essentially, but now we don't have to have to-do.id. It just has the ID here in the template literal. The method is delete, and the body only contains the ID because that's all that is needed to delete the to-do. And now that we've added these new methods, we can just scroll down here to our export const, and we just need to add those other hooks that are created. And notice once again, they're not queries. They are all mutations. So they start with use and end with mutations. So we created an add to do method, and so it's use add to do mutation. The same for use update to do mutation and use delete to do mutation. Okay, let's save these and head back to the to-do list to use all of these new hooks. So instead of just the use to-dos query being imported, we're going to import in the other 3 hooks that were created as well. And then under where we use the use get to-dos query hook, we'll paste these in, and you can see we're just getting the functions from these hooks. We don't really need to wait on the is loading, is success, is error, and all of those things that we get from the query when we're reading the data. This is something we're actually doing to the data. So add to do, update to do, and delete to do. And now the first function we'll put to work is that add to do. So right here inside of the handle submit, I'll paste this in and let's take a look. We've got the add to do, and all it really expects to receive is a to do. So I'm creating a to do object here. We're passing in the new to do. We're setting the completed to false, and I'm just setting them all to user ID 1. If you wanted to create a drop menu and provide different user IDs, you could. The data has user IDs in it, so that's really up to you and how you want to do it. Right now, the way this is set up, every new to do that is added would be attributed to user 1. And now let's add some more detail to our conditional content. So where we have the JSON stringify, let's replace that and map over all of the to-dos to create something that's a little bit more like we want. I'll hide the file tree so we can see it all. But what we're doing is mapping over all of the to-dos instead of the JSON stringify here. And then we're returning an article. And each article is going to have a key that matches the to-do.id because there's lots of articles that will be rendered on the page, one for each to-do. And then we've got a div here with a class name of to-do, and that holds the input, and then that is the checkbox. And then it also holds the label, which is the description, and that label has the HTML4, which we're also assigning to the ID of the input, so they're linked. And using a label here instead of a span or a paragraph really helps with accessibility as well because it's linked to that checkbox. Other than that, when we change, we're calling the update to do. And what we do there is spread in the existing to do, then we overwrite the completed state because this change is for the checkbox. And so that just sets the completed state to false if it was true or true if it was false. And then, of course, we have a button here, and the button has the trash can icon, and that calls the delete to do. And we're just passing in an object with that ID. So we've got ID and then to-do.id right here. Okay, with these changes saved, let's pull our code back over and take a look at our app. Well, this looks much better. So let's see what happens if we go ahead and click on things. It's not changing, is it? It's not updating. Let's see if it deletes. Doesn't seem to be deleting. I wonder what's going on. Maybe we can add a new to-do and we'll say learn stuff. And let's see if it's added. It will be all the way at the bottom. It's not at the bottom either. So let's talk about what's going on. I actually know what's going on, but we needed to create this situation to understand it. So back in the API slice, if we look at these, what is happening is the results get cached, and we're not invalidating the previous cache. And so it's not updating to show the new changes, whether that's a delete, an update, or even a new to-do list, or not a new to-do list, a new to-do item added to the to-do list. It's not showing any of that because we're still seeing the cached version of the data. What we need to do is assign a tag to the cache and then let it know which mutations invalidate the cache, and so then it will automatically refetch that data for us. So the first thing we're going to do after the base query here is put in tag types, and we're going to name this to-dos. And then for our get to-dos method that we have here, we need to put in a provides tags and say it's providing this tag of to-dos. So then we'll need to invalidate the to-dos cache when we use these builder mutations below, whether we're creating a new to-do, updating, or deleting. And I'll scroll just a little bit, but we can add those right here by putting a comma after the query inside the mutation and then saying invalidates tags to-dos. And so let's do that for each one of these so we know the change has been made. Actually, let's just do it for the update and the create and not the delete, and we'll be able to see the difference once again. So now let's drag this back over to the left and look at our to-do list. So for the new one, we could now say learn stuff. Press enter should work. There we go. Let's see if we have our learn stuff at the bottom. Yep, now we've got learn stuff twice because I typed that earlier with 2 exclamation marks. Now we've just got 1. So let's try the delete. We're not seeing anything from the delete, are we? Because it's not updating. So it actually did create this earlier, and it is actually deleting it now, but our list is not re-rendering. Likewise, we should go ahead and see a re-render of the list if I update an item. Yep, and now that learn stuff disappeared because it really isn't in the current state of the to-dos that we have at the API. However, trying to delete something did not cause the list to re-render, whereas updating it did. So let's go ahead and add that mutation back over here as well. Let's find that. We've got the invalidate tags, and that's what we want to add is to that delete mutation. So we put the comma there and put in invalidates tags and save. Now we've re-rendered everything. And now if I were to say delete this second one here, our list re-renders. And if I were to check, then it re-renders and shows that new state as well. Likewise, if I were to say hey for a new item and press enter, we should now see it. And this also highlights our last problem. Any new to-do item we're adding is added at the very bottom of the list. I'd rather see this in reverse order and see my new item at the top of the list. And we can also fix this because much like Axios, RTK query provides a transform response. So there I can put in my sort function, and I'm going to drag Visual Studio Code back over to see everything for now so you can see this clearly. We've got a transform response right after our query, and here I'm just passing in the response. And then I'm calling a basic sort function here for numbers in JavaScript because we're using the ID numbers. And to sort it in ascending order, it would be A minus B, but to sort in descending, it's B minus A. So I'll just save this. And now we should be transforming that response that we get from the API, and it should be sorting it in reverse order. And we've kept the logic once again out of the component and put it over here with the API logic for RTK query. I'll pull this to the left and we'll look, and now my hey is at the top of the list. I can delete that, delete my learn stuff, and even the new to do, and then add another new to do, and it's right at the top. So overall, you've got a quick introduction to RTK query here, and we've created read, update, create, and delete functions, or methods if you will, inside of our API slice, provided that to our complete application, and then of course implemented those in our to-do list component. We have a nice little to-do list here, and we've kept all of this API logic basically out of the components and in our separate API slice. I've got a Redux blog project here on the left, and on the right I've got Chrome DevTools open, and we're at the Network tab. Now I'm going to click a reaction emoji, and when I do, we see a couple of network requests. One's just the pre-flight request that we see here, and then the fetch request to update the data. But as I continue to click, we see that the reaction responds immediately, and then afterwards comes the fetch request to update the data. That's an optimistic update. We're going to apply that and more. Let's get started. The starter code for today's tutorial is in the completed source code from lesson 5 in this Redux series when we last worked on a React Redux blog project. And we're transitioning the blog project we completed with Axios and Async Thunks in lesson 5 to RTK query with normalized cache state and even some optimistic updates. You can get a link to that starter code in the description below. Now up to lesson 5 we were using the JSON placeholder fake API, but today we're going to switch switch over to JSON server. And I've already added a data folder up here in our file tree. And inside that folder is this db.json file. And you can see I've already put some users data in here, and there's also post data. So once we scroll past the 10 users, then we should have around 100 posts. Now I've modified the data some by already playing around with it, but you've basically got 100 posts here inside of this data. And of course, this is with the code that you can download in the description, or you can go to the JSON placeholder site like I did and just grab the data that they have there and paste it into this db.json file. But remember, if you do that, you would be grabbing the users and making that one data array. And then as you see here, I've got posts and it's a separate data array, but you can put it all within the same file, and it just needs to start out as an object. So once I get here to the top, you can see it starts out as one large object, and that's what JSON server uses. Okay, now if you don't have JSON server yet, it's not a package you add to your project, but you can install it globally like I have, or you could use npx if you're familiar with that. I'll show you what I've done, which is npm I for install, and then JSON server, and then -g, which means globally, so you could just start it from any command line like that. I've already installed it, so I'm not going to hit return there, but then after you've installed it, you want to go ahead and start it, and to do that, it's JSON server, then we're going to say -- watch, then we tell it where our data is, so it's data/db.json. Then I'm going to say what port I want it to run on, and that's 3500 because it's simulating our back end. And now I'm going to press return. It starts up, it sees our users, it sees our posts, and it's ready to go. So now if I start our project, I'm going to open a separate command line to start our project on later on after we make some changes. Okay, now we're going to go into our source folder, and inside the source folder, inside the features folder that we have, we're going to create an API folder as well. So we'll create that API folder, and inside of it, we'll create a new file called API slice with a capital S, as in camel case, and then it's .js. Once we have our API slice, I'll paste in a little bit of code, and let's discuss what we've got here before we move on. So we are importing create API and fetch base query, and this comes from Redux.js Toolkit query /React, since we're using React today. And then we say export, so we can export the API slice. We define the API slice using create API. And then here it's an object inside. Now this looks a little different than what you might have seen in my intro to RTK query, because notice we're not defining any endpoints here. We're passing a builder in, but we essentially have no endpoints right here. Now we need to have this because it's required. But what we're going to do is create extended slices so we can separate our logic, say, from posts and users for our project. And this reducer path is optional if you name it API, because that's the default. If you want to name it something else, it's not optional. The base query here is a lot like Axios, where we would define a base query, and we use that fetch base query that we import, and here we provide that base URL. Today I'm providing localhost 3500. If you were to use this with an API online, you would need to put, of course, that URL there. The tag types we're going to use with this slice right now is post. So I'm only putting post there, as I'm going to give you examples for the posts. And later on, I'll let you complete the users yourself and compare that to my completed source code on GitHub. Okay, with the API slice complete, now we have a lot of work to do inside of our post slice, because this is where we're going to have our extended API slice. So we can start out now by removing some things, and we're going to remove all of those async thunks we initially created here. So we've got fetch posts, add new post, update and delete. I can just select all of those and hit backspace to get rid of them. We're also going to be able to get rid of our post URL because we're going to use what we defined already in our slice. We're not going to use create async thunk anymore, so I can get rid of that. And I believe I can even get rid of create slice. So I'll go ahead and do that as well. We're left with create selector and create entity adapter. You can see we're no longer going to use Axios either. So removing quite a few things right now. Go ahead and get rid of that blank line at the top. We'll keep our post adapter. We're going to continue to use our create entity adapter. We're going to continue to have normalized state. We're going to continue to sort the posts right here so we can have them in reverse order or the most recent post at the top of our list. We can empty out this initial state though. We no longer need that. So let's go ahead and just make that an empty one there. And now we need to add to our imports. So I'm just going to put this underneath our import of sub from date FNS. And we're importing in our API slice that we created. Let's make sure we have the correct path for that. So I'll type it again. So we're going to go up out of posts, and then we'll go into the API folder, and then there is the API slice. So yep, that's right. We'll save that. Get rid of this extra line here. And really, we're going to get rid of our post slice altogether. Even though we're really still in this post slice file, we'll still use that name because we're extending the API slice to handle that. So I'm going to select everything here with the post slice, including the extra reducers that we have down here. And we're going to end up replacing all of that. So I'll hit backspace once again. And what I'm going to replace it with is, if I could scroll over, oh, I just missed some of it here. So what I need is an export const. Oh, I had the first part of export. That's what I was doing. There we go. So export const API slice. And now this equals the API slice we imported. And then you can see we have .inject endpoints. So this is where we will put our endpoints now. And that's all going to start with an endpoints builder. So I can go ahead and put that in as well. So here's our definition for endpoints like we're used to seeing in the API slice if you completed that basic intro to RTK query where we created a to-do list. You saw this same structure, but it was all in the API slice. And you can see the endpoints are also here in the API slice, but we just didn't do anything with them, but you have to have them or you'll have an error. So now we've got the endpoints here with the builder and we're ready to define any of our endpoints inside. So now I'm going to scroll up so we can see a little bit more of the screen we're going to use, and I'm going to paste in our first endpoint function here. Now, it is long enough, it took up the whole screen. So I'll save and let's break this down. So this is get posts, meaning we're going to get all of our posts. And then we have builder.query, as we've seen before in the intro to RTK query. So we're just issuing a query here to the /posts. And of course, this is attached to that base URL that we provided in the API slice. So if we go back here, we see our base URL of localhost port 3500. So we're attaching /posts onto that and just issuing a get query for those posts. But then we're using transform response, and we're doing this for a couple of reasons here. And that, of course, has a function. So we've got response data. One is the data that I pulled into that DB.json file doesn't have the date or the reactions attached to it because I pulled it straight from that JSON placeholder website. So if we have any of the posts that we receive that don't already have that, we need to go ahead and attach that starter data to them. So what I'm doing here is defining a minute so we can increment that and use it for each post so they don't all have the exact same time. I'm going to hide the file tree, Control B, and we should be able to see more of this now. So then we define loaded posts, and this is using map on the response data. So we're just creating a new posts array here that we'll be able to use. And we're saying if the post doesn't already have date data, then set the post.date to this new date. And of course, each post is being incremented by a minute, so they're all 1 minute apart. Same for reactions. If the post doesn't have reactions, then we're setting the reactions all to 0 as it first comes in. So that's the first purpose of transform response. The second purpose here that we need to use as we're using RTK query with the entity adapter is to go ahead and normalize our state. So we need to send this new state to the posts adapter, and we do that with set all. And then we pass in the initial state, and remember we had that initial state defined already. And then we also have loaded posts. Now if I go up here to the initial state, we've got the initial state right there. Okay, and then the loaded post that we defined right here. So we're passing that into set all, and that normalizes our data. And if you remember from a previous tutorial, normalized data would have an array of just the IDs, and then it has an entities array as well. And it's really an entities object that has a bunch of objects in it in each post. And then we can use that IDs array as an object lookup with the entities when we refer to each post. Okay, then we've got provides tags, and this is a little more complex than we saw in our basic to-do list example in the intro. So what it is an array that we see defined right here. And the first entry, we're just identifying as list. It's type post, as all of these will be. But that just means we're identifying the list, and any time that we invalidate one of these tags, it will reperform or auto fetch essentially all the posts again. So if we want to get the full list, we can just invalidate the list ID. But what we're also doing now is providing an object for each separate individual post, passing the ID from the post. And we're doing that by mapping over the result, but we're also spreading it into individual post IDs here. So this is what we end up with, type post and ID for each post. So if any one of those post IDs are invalidated, it will also refetch our list automatically because this is invalidated. And that's what provides tags does. So that is our full method right there for get posts. Now also, if you remember from the intro lesson, the previous lesson to RTK query, it generates hooks, so custom hooks already based on the methods we create above. So we have get posts, so it creates use get posts query, and we'll be able to use that in our post list component. But before we move on to that component, let's scroll down and look at our selectors. Now here we have a get selectors, and it creates selectors and we rename them with aliases. We're going to leave this alone right here because we're still going to create all these selectors and rename them with aliases. Everything below the get selectors here we're no longer using, so we can remove everything you see right here. So we'll just hit backspace and eliminate that. Now I'm going to post a couple of new selectors, or paste a couple of new selectors right here above, and let's break these down. Let's talk about what these do. So the first one, as you see in my note here, it just returns the query result object. It doesn't issue the query, it returns the result object that we already have from the query. So select post result equals extended API slice that we defined above, then dot endpoints, because that is an object, dot get post referring to the method, and then calling select right there. So we're getting that result object. But that is the entire result object. It's not just the data. So then we need to use create selector, which we had already previously imported, to create this select post data. And if you remember, create selector receives input function or functions and then has an output function. So what we're passing in as the input function is our select post result query. And then our output function is taking that result and then just looking at the data property. And that data property holds our normalized state object that has the IDs array and then the entities as well. And now let's scroll just a little bit, because while we're keeping these selectors and renaming them here, we need to change how get selectors finds the state, because that has changed. So what we're doing is we're going to use the select post data selector that we have up here. So I'll just paste this in, and let's look at what this does. We're passing the state as we were before, but now we're using select post data to say where the state is. And of course, it returns our normalized state. And that's great, but it could be null, especially the first time the app loads. So we want to use this nullish coalescing operator here that says basically if what's on the left is null, it's going to return what's on the right, and that is our initial state. And so that's the only change we need to make there, and all of these selectors will still be good. Okay, let's look at the file tree again, because we've made enough changes. We need to change our store as well. So in the app folder, we have store.js. Now we no longer have a posts reducer, so I'm going to remove that, And in its place, I'm going to import that API slice that we have created. Once again, let's make sure we're in the right place. We'd go up out of the app folder and then into the features folder, API folder, and then API slice. So that does look correct. And now down here, we don't have a post reducer. What we do have is the API slice. So I will paste this in and we'll break this down as well. So this is going to be dynamically named, but whatever name we put in that reducer path. Remember, we named it API inside of the API slice, and that was right here inside of the API slice. Optional because that's the default, but if you named it something else, it could have a different name. And so that's why we just want to make this dynamic right here, saying API slice dot reducer path, and then it's computed if you want to use that terminology. And then we would have the value over here just saying API slice dot reducer, our comma, and then we're just going to leave the user's reducer as it is for now. But now as we use RTK query with the store, there's some required middleware. So I'll paste this in, save for the formatting, it looks right, and we'll discuss this. What this is middleware here. And the first thing we need to do is get default middleware. And that's the middleware that is already the default with Redux. So we just need to make sure we have that. And this is an array that is returned. So then we use concat. And now we're also adding the API slice middleware that we need that API slice creates. And this middleware from API slice, it manages cache lifetimes and expirations, and it is required to use it when we're using RTK query and an API slice. Now we finished changes in the store.js, but we also need to make some changes in the index.js. So we're no longer going to use fetch posts. We already deleted that async thunk. And in its place, we're going to import in that extended API slice once again. And let's make sure we have the correct route to that post slice here to bring in that extended API slice. So it's /features/API. Oh, it was not API, actually, it was post/post slice, because we're bringing in the extended API slice that we created in the post slice. Okay, after we do that, we're no longer using fetch posts, but we still want to get the post immediately at app load time. And so I'll just change this. We're still going to use store.dispatch, but now we use the extended API slice. Remember, it's an object, so then we go .endpoints, .get posts, and we call initiate, and it gets that initial data and request it at that point. And so then we can load that data once again as the app starts up. Okay, with the changes we've made up to this point, now we're ready to go to that post list component and use the use get post query custom hook that was generated from our get posts inside of the post slice where we have the extended API slice. So now at the top here, we'll probably end up with some imports we're not going to use, but for now, I'll just put in the import that I know we are going to use, which is use get post query, coming from our post slice that's in the same folder. So that should just be ./post slice. So now inside the component, let's go ahead and use this use get post query hook, and you can see it has several different things here. It has is loading, is success, is error, and of course if we do have an error, we want to define that error. So that means we're not going to need some of these other things as well. So let's go ahead and at least remove the error that we know we're not going to use, and we'll see what else we're not using afterwards. This is going to change this just a little bit because we're using new indicators, but we don't have to change it a lot. So instead of looking for post status equals loading, we're just looking for is loading. And then instead of post status succeeded, we're just looking for is success. And then of course the else if post status equals failed, we're just looking for is error. And now let's see if we need to change anything else. I'll hit Control B so we can see this full line, but it pretty much will stay the same, I believe. So there is our new content. We're still using the ordered post IDs.map. Notice that was up here above, and that's because we're still using the selector select post IDs that we already modified and made sure that the new state is being found inside of that post slice file. So it looks like we can get rid of this post status that we've defined. And if we come up here at the top, it looks like we can get rid of get post status and get post error as well from the imports and save. Now, I would normally check our post lists at this time, but we have changed so much about the post slice where our app will still be broken in many ways if we attempt to run it right now. So let's go ahead and keep making some changes. I'll go back to the file tree. One thing that I do want to quickly change that really has nothing to do with our RTK query, normalized cache state, or optimistic updates that we're applying today is the post author component. And I had just noticed really that we're not using a link on the author's name. So I'm going to go ahead and put in the link, import link from React Router DOM, and then inside of the author where we're just displaying the author name inside of this ternary right here, I'm just going to change this one line, and maybe we can break it into separate lines so we can see a little bit better. But essentially, if true, we're going to return this link instead of just the author name, so we're linking to the author page. Other than that, we're not changing anything else here in the post author. And this will be in the completed source code as well, but if you want to quickly make the change, it's just link from React Router DOM, and then it's providing the link to that user page with the user ID. We already have the routing in place. It's just something I hadn't previously added. Okay, let's go back to the post slice and continue to add these methods so we can eventually check our app and it won't be broken. So we've got get posts right here, but after get posts, we have a comma. We're ready to put in our next method. I'll scroll up because it will take up just as much room really. Paste this in, and let's look at what this is. It's get posts by user ID. So it's going to be just a little different. We now have a query that is receiving an argument. So we set it up here with the parameter definition of ID, and this is going to request posts, and then it's going to have the user ID attached to this request. And so that will give us the post just from a specific user ID. We're using the transform response just as we did above here. So really the exact same concept, because we still need to add this information to the posts if it doesn't exist. And we're again using postAdapter.setAll. Now this does not overwrite the cache state of the request for the full list of posts, because Redux is subscribing to these different queries, which we'll be able to see when we complete if we use Redux DevTools, because now this will have a cache state for this specific query as well. And again, with the post adapter, we are normalizing this state. So it will also be normalized with an IDs array and then having each post inside of the entities object. Okay, we'll scroll down here and look at provides tags. Now, much like above, we're not giving an ID of the full list, but we are spreading the result that's ran through the map here. And look, we're using the IDs array, and then we have the post and the ID. So we could invalidate this query for any one of these queries, I guess any one of the users, because we would be looking at the individual posts. So if any one of those posts were invalidated in the future, it could know to invalidate this cache and rerun this query by auto-fetching essentially. And now remember, each method that we add above here, so get post by user ID, creates another custom hook. So I'm just going to select all of this and paste in the change. What we've done is add the next custom hook, which is use get posts by user ID. That was the name we had, so it starts out with use and ends with query when this creates the custom hook. And now that we kind of know what we're doing here with the methods inside of this extended API slice, let's just go ahead and add the next method. And now this won't be a query, this will be a mutation. So we have builder.mutation. The previous ones were queries because we were just querying data, but now we're adding a new post. So our other methods, essentially updating, deleting, adding, any of those things will be mutations. Here we're passing in a post, and I named this initial post because that's essentially what it is. And we'll be posting to that /posts URL. So the method is post. And then we're just adjusting a couple of things here. So we're actually spreading in the post object, and then we're overriding the user ID, making sure it's a number and not a string as we post it. We are adjusting the date, and we're setting the reactions. This is a new post, so all the reactions would be 0. Now, a huge difference here from the queries, as we perform a mutation, we're using invalidates tags instead of provides tags. And this is going to invalidate the list. There's no individual post because this post didn't already exist, but it would be part of the list. So this should invalidate the post list cache. Okay, scrolling up again for some more room. And we'll put the next one, which is the update. So this update post is once again a builder mutation. Once again receives that post object. And notice now, since this is an update, I'm getting the ID property from that initial post object. This is a put method that we're using. We're spreading in the original post, and then we're going ahead and updating the date. Everything else will already exist because it was already a pre-existing post. So here we don't have to worry about it actually having those other bits of data that we were adding before here as we queried the data and then put it inside of our cache. So now once we update, we're just updating the state. This is going to invalidate tags as well. And it's going to invalidate whichever post ID was there. And so instead of just the result here, we're using the argument because the argument was that initial post. So we're saying argument.id, just like we say initial post.id right here. And finally, let's go ahead and add the delete as well. So let's put the delete post right here. It's much the same. Now we're not getting the full post as the argument. So this parameter just needs to be the ID. So what we can do is destructure the ID that we're getting from the post. We don't need the rest of the post anywhere. And then we're just passing that ID here to the URL. It's posts/ID. So we have that specific ID, and that's what we're deleting. And of course here we're providing that ID in the body of the request. Once again, just like the update, it's the argument. And so the argument is going to be this object. Now we're not destructuring here, so we're saying argument.id. And with our methods all now in place, we just need to update our exports here. I'm going to once again just select all of these and paste over. But you can see we've added the add new post mutation. So because these are not queries, they are mutations, they end in mutation. They still begin with the word use. So we created add new post, and the hook created is use add new post mutation. The same for use update post mutation and use delete post mutation. Let's save these changes, and now we can move on to the components. So I'll go back to the file tree, and we're ready to make changes to not the post list. I went there by habit, but we're going to change the add post form component. I'll press Control B to hide the file tree once again, and we're going to start out with an import, and we need to import that mutation we created. So this will be the use add new post mutation that comes from the post slice. Now we will no longer use dispatch, so I'm just going to highlight that and paste over it, and we'll bring in this add new post function from our use add new post mutation. Notice I'm also bringing in an isLoading variable here, and so we can use that as well when we create our content, so we can use it conditionally. And now that we're doing that, we're not going to bring in add new post from the post slice. That has been removed already. And we're also not going to bring in use dispatch, so I can get rid of that from the imports as well. And now we can get rid of our add request status. We won't be using that state anymore where we have use state set to idle, so we can remove that line of code. And now I'll go ahead and scroll down, and we're going to be inside of our on save post click function. What we won't do anymore is set the add request status. We've removed that state, and we will no longer dispatch add new post like we see here. So I'm going to select both of these and replace it with what we will now do, and this is await. So we need to change our on save post to async. And now we're going to await our add new post function that we're bringing in from our use add new post mutation. And then we'll pass in the post. So we'll have the title, the body with the content that we're creating, and then we'll have the user ID here as well. We'll still use unwrap because we're still in a try catch block. But now we can also remove this finally block from the try catch block because we're no longer using the add request status. And one final change in our add post form, and that is going to be to replace the add request status we were checking here. As we set the can save value, that's now going to check is loading, and we want to make sure it is not loading, and that's when can save should work. So let's go ahead and save. And now back to the file tree, we're going to make changes that are nearly identical to our edit post form, but our edit post form is going to be able to update and delete, so that makes a change or two as well. The first thing we'll do is import our mutations, and now we have two mutations, so you can see we're using use update post mutation and use delete post mutation. I'll hide the file tree again with Control B. And once again, inside the component, let's go ahead and use both of those. So I'll paste that right here, and we're bringing in the update post function and once again an is loading status from the update, and then we're bringing in a delete post function from that use delete post mutation hook as well. After that, we will not need the dispatch, so we can remove that, and once again we will not need the request status or set request status state, so we can remove that too. And it looks like I've got an extra line I'll remove. Now I'll go ahead and scroll up, and we should be changing some of the same things here as well. So on can save, once again, we are going to change that request status idle that we're no longer using state for to just making sure that is loading is not true. Now I'll scroll up a little more. We need to change our on save post click here to an async function. We'll once again remove the set request status and the dispatch, and I'll replace that with an await update post, and here we pass in the post once again that is being created, and once again we use unwrap because we're inside of a try catch block. Now we can remove the finally block from the try catch block as well. But we're not quite finished because that's just saving the update. So we need to scroll down because we also have on delete post clicked, which will also make an async function. We'll remove the set request status and the dispatch here as well. And in this place, we'll put the await delete post. And here we just pass in the post ID because if you remember, that's all that's needed back in our extended API slice. We're using unwrap here as well because it's in the try catch block, and we can remove the finally as well. Now there's one more big component change we need to make, so we'll go back to the file tree, but this is not in the post folder at all. It's actually in the users folder, and it's going to be on the user page. Remember, we're getting posts by the user ID, so we can display them, of course, on the user page. So that's what we're going to do here. Let's go ahead and add the import we need, and that's going to be use get posts by user ID query. So we're coming up out of the users folder, into the post folder, and grabbing that post slice where that new custom hook is created by RTK query. I'm going to hide the file tree once again. We will not need this import with select all posts or select posts by user. So we can go ahead and remove that import, and below we'll bring in our hook right where we define posts for user. So let's just paste over that. And now you can see with the get posts by user ID query, and we're passing in the user ID that we get from use params with React Router. So once we have that, we're defining the data we get from this hook as posts for user. So it can replace what we were doing. And now we have that same status that we did before, so we can conditionally render our components. So we have is loading, is success, is error, and then of course error if there is an error. And now our content is going to change somewhat. So what I'm going to do is just select the post titles and paste over it where we create our content. And we're actually going to call it content. So while I'm thinking of it, I'll come down here in the JSX and just paste our content in here instead where we have post titles. So we'll just change that to content. Okay, to break this down up above, we're defining content, and then we're checking those different progresses. So we have is loading. So if that's true, we're just going to change the content to a loading status. Then we have is success. And this is where it gets a little more complicated because remember, we now have normalized state. So our posts for users, the data that we receive, has that IDs array. And then it has the entities object that has all of the individual posts for the user. So we're destructuring that right here, and we're mapping over the IDs array. Now for each ID, we can create a list item, and we're going to link to the post. But then when we get to the content here and we need the title, we have to use that entities object as a lookup object. So we pass in the ID, and that gives us the specific post. It's an object lookup, and then we can reference the title. And then our final, of course, is if isError is true, then we display the error. And that's all the changes we need to make. Well, at least that's all the changes we need to make for this component. Let's go ahead and move back to the file tree because we have just a couple of more changes to make before everything is going to work in our application. One area we need to fix, and this is just left over from the previous tutorial, is the header.js, because we're going ahead and importing in increase count and get count when we just displayed something in that tutorial about count, and we don't really need it here. And of course the dispatch and setting count here as well, we're not going to use any of that. So let's go ahead and remove those. Let's remove the button that had the count because it's really not a feature we need in our blog that we're going to use. And that means we don't need the imports of use dispatch and use selector. So if you have that in your starter code, you can remove everything to do with the count outside or inside of the header component. So we just removed all of that. And now the last thing we really need to do is move on to the reactions. And that is inside of the posts directory here inside of features. And we'll go to the reaction buttons.js, but we're also going to have to go back to that post slice where our extended API slice is and make one more method here inside of the extended API slice. Now this is a larger method that I'm going to put in here, so we'll definitely break it down after I paste it in. And here it is. So we'll scroll up here. We've got add reaction. It is once again a builder mutation, but we don't want to reload our list every time we add a reaction. So we're going to do this differently. And this is what is called an optimistic update. And that's what we're going to perform here. So I'll press Control B to hide the file tree again, and let's break this all down. First, we have a query, and this query is going to receive a post ID and the reactions. Notice we're destructuring those from the object being sent in. Okay, then we have the URL that's just going to posts with the post ID. The method is going to be patch. Now, notice this note right here, and this comes directly from the docs example as well, and they're absolutely right. It says in a real app, we'd probably need to base this on the user ID somehow, so a user can't do the same reaction more than once. And that is true. With this current setup, a user will be able to have a reaction more than once. What we're doing differently from the docs example is they were just passing in the individual reaction and incrementing it because they didn't give this example with normalized state. I'm passing in all of the reactions for the post, and then we're going to replace the existing reactions with the reactions that are passed in. Okay, once we have that, and that would typically be what we would do, but now notice we have an onQuery started handler. Now this is a little different. We're once again passing the post ID and the reactions, just like we did above with the query. But then it has a second parameter as well. That parameter has some things in there we can use. One is dispatch, and another is query fulfilled, which is a promise. And so we're going to look at that to know some status as well. Now our note, update query data, it says it requires the endpoint name and cache key arguments so it knows which piece of cache state to update. Well, that's what we're going to do right down here. So we're defining patch result, then we're using dispatch that we got from the second parameter up here of the onQuery started handler. And what we're going to dispatch is extended API.util, which we hadn't seen before, and then we can get this update query data. And there is where we pass in the endpoint. Now we have undefined here for that cache key argument, I believe, but we do have the endpoint, and that's all we really need. But the draft is a draft of our data. So this is immer wrapped. So we're once again using immer.js like we did inside of create slice. And the data here can be mutated because then immer.js will handle it correctly for us. So what I'm going to do is define the post and set it equal to draft.entities. Remember, this is a draft of our data, and our data has the IDs array and the entities object. and I'll pass in that post ID. So this is an object lookup again. So I'm getting that specific post. And then if that post exists, I'm setting the reactions to the reactions that we passed in to this builder mutation. And so that would normally be a mutation here, but Immer.js is going to handle that correctly for us. Now, after we do all of that, what happens is we await for that promise to fulfill, the promise that was in the parameter here, so query fulfilled. Otherwise, we're going to undo this patch, and that's if it catches an error there, it will undo it. And that is because this is an optimistic update. So what we're really doing inside of this patch result here is updating our cache, and that is happening optimistically, possibly before the data at the API has been updated. So we're instantly seeing that in our UI. What happens is we click on the reaction and it instantly updates, and then you see the network request go to the API to go ahead and update that data so it will match what we already see in our UI. But if it fails for any reason, then it will undo what we have changed inside of our cache, our data as well. So that is why we look for query fulfilled, and we hope it fulfills. But if for some reason it doesn't, just because we've optimistically updated doesn't mean that it cannot be undone. So that's how that works, an optimistic update. And I know it's a little bit more complicated than just sending and receiving data from the API, and of course updating our state with that as well. But we're optimistically updating our cache possibly before the data is received at the API with this setup. And then a final note on this add reaction. Notice we're not using invalidates tags anywhere with this. And that is because we don't want to refetch the list every time a reaction is added. So we're not going to invalidate any post or list. What we're going to do is optimistically update the cache already and not have to do another request, but we are going to update the data at the API as well. Okay, let's save these changes, and now let's move to the add reaction, or I'm sorry, the reaction buttons component. And what we're going to do is add reaction. So we can remove this import use dispatch and import reaction added from the post slice. We'll no longer need those. What we will import is the use add reaction mutation from the post slice. Now let's go ahead and remove dispatch from the component itself, and we'll replace that with calling our use add reaction mutation hook and getting the add reaction function from it. Now I'm going to scroll up, and we're just going to change a little bit about our button. We will still use object.entries, and we'll still use the reaction emoji here and map over it with the name and the emoji. No changes there. The button will still have a key that's the name, type button, class name, reaction button, but our on click will definitely change. So let's go ahead and replace the on click. And you can see what we're doing now is defining a new value, and we're getting the post.reactions name and adding 1 to it. So that's the new value. Then when we add reaction, we're passing in all of the reactions. So we've got the post ID that we need that's passed in, and then the reactions here. So we spread in the post reactions, and then we overwrite the current reaction with that new value. And so now it will have the increment for that one reaction. Then down here, everything should still be the same. We've got emoji, post.reactions, and the name that shows. And our JSX just shows the reaction buttons. So that's all good. We can save those changes. I think we're just about ready to try out our application. Let's go back to the post slice. I'm thinking after I discussed this add reaction, which is the builder mutation that's fairly large, we didn't go ahead and add it to our export here of the different custom hooks. So let's do that as well. This would be use add reaction mutation. So now let's save that. Okay, let's open up a command line. Remember, we have got our JSON server running at the other command line. So we open up a second one now. And here I'm going to type npm start, and this should fire up our blog. So let's see what we get for our blog in the web page. It was loading, and now we have our blog. It looks like everything's good. See if we can view a post. We're viewing the post. We can view the author page and see other posts from that author. So that all looks good. Let's see a list of users. That's good. And remember, we have not changed our users over from the async thunk and the user slice that we created before. That's going to be your assignment at the end of this tutorial. Then you can look at my completed code on GitHub to match that up. But while we have this open, let's go ahead and see if we can add some reactions, and they increment quickly. That's great. So everything is working as we expect. Now let's go ahead and look here at this in DevTools, this application in DevTools, and we'll open up Redux here. So now we can check some of our state and see what's being used in the state. I wish I had just a little bit more room, but overall we have the API and we have users in the state. So let's look at the API, and then it has queries. And if we open up the queries, you can see get posts has been used, and then we used get posts by user ID. And then they both keep their own information. So then we'll have data from that get posts. And inside here, we see the data has the IDs array and the entities. If we look at the IDs array, it's just an array of ID numbers. And then the entities is an array, or not an array, actually, it's an object, but it has the number 2 and then the object assigned to it. So if we drop that down, then you see ID2 title. You'll see the full post. Entity has each one, but it's also an object with a number as it goes. So that's why we can use it as an object lookup with the IDs. And then any changes we make, we can look at the differences, and you can also see what the state is subscribed to or the different actions. So Redux DevTools, linked to in the description, is very, very useful as well. But now let's go to the network tab and see what we get here when we make different requests. Right now, we'll request the home page. There's no more network requests there because we've already got those post lists. So now let's go ahead and go to Leanne Graham's page, and notice then we had a user ID equal 1 request, and that was a fetch. So we got that data, and we can look at an individual post. If we go back to Leanne's page, no other network request. It didn't happen again because it gets it from the cache. Now, if we go to the users and request another user ID, then we see that user ID equal to 10, and now that is also cached. So now we have 2 cached queries there for users. We can look at an individual post there, but if we go back to that user, we don't see another request. If we go back to users here, go back to Leanne Graham, we don't see another request because we already have that data here. Now it will eventually expire, and Redux handles that for us as well. Remember that middleware handles those expirations. So you can see how efficient this would be. Now, if we change something, say we update a post, so let's view the post, then let's choose edit post, and here I'll just change the text of the post to testing, and then I'll save that. Now you can see several things happen. We had a pre-flight request here with this post, and then there was the fetch, and you can see it was actually a put request that was sent, and we got 200 for that. And then that caused the posts to invalidate the cache, so the posts were once again fetched at that point. So there you can see how everything is working, and you can play around with that in Redux DevTools and also look at the network tab. But it's all working as expected. Congratulations if you followed me all the way through to the end of this project. You now have a fully functioning blog that has integrated normalized cache state, and it has some optimistic updates, which is something else we didn't do there, but we can go ahead and do the reactions. I guess open the console back up. Now we should see a network request for every reaction, and there we see that. So if I do it again, we'll continue to see that. One was a pre-flight request, but the others were fetch. And we're doing the optimistic updates. So notice it updates here immediately, and then we see the request. So overall, we've implemented a lot of things here with Redux Toolkit and RTK Query. We've got React going, normalized state, optimistic updates. Congratulations on making it to the end of this. I hope it's given you a good start with Redux Toolkit. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you. And thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.